Hello, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Natural Areas Association's virtual symposium, Shared Stewardship, Collaborating to Effectively Co-Manage the Chippewa National Forest. I'm Lisa Smith, Executive Director of the Natural Areas Association, and I'm being joined today by my colleagues, Maura McGinty-Kloss, Programs and Communications Manager, and Amy Wills, Operations and Membership Manager. Thank you for joining us for this virtual program. And while NAA is once again convening in-person events, which is very exciting, we're pleased to continue offering virtual programming because we strongly believe that good science and collaboration must be available to everyone, and not just those who have the time, ability, and means to travel to an in-person event. I'd like to thank our sponsors of this program today, the USDA Forest Service. We've been longtime partners, our organization and the agency. Together, we've produced a lot of wonderful programming and have worked together to convey good science to those who are boots on the ground working to manage nature. And I'd like to thank them especially for this program, which is a very special one today, being brought to you by the both of us. So. The Natural Areas Association, for those of you who are new to us, is a national nonprofit organization that serves practitioners who manage ecologically significant landscapes to protect biodiversity. We contend that protecting natural areas in perpetuity requires quality science to inform practices and access to reliable resources. Given this, NAA provides science-based content for practitioners and researchers, those seeking applied science, practical solutions, and knowledge related to the management of biodiversity and ecologically significant lands and waters. NAA shares a suite of programs, products, and services that allow us to address a broad spectrum of current and emerging issues, methodologies, and best practices in a manner that is useful and convenient for busy practitioners. And our programs are designed to achieve on-the-ground outcomes and to encourage practitioner participation, especially with one another. I'd like to share just a few examples of these programs with you. We won't get into too much of our work today as we've got a big program for you. But our 49th Natural Areas Conference is coming up, and it will be held in Duluth, Minnesota, the first full week of September this year. The title of the conference is Superior Visions, Navigating Complexity Amid Constant Change. And the conference will feature more than 100 presentations developed by and for natural areas practitioners, including keynotes and plenary sessions, concurrent breakout sessions, half-day hands-on workshops, posters, and field workshops. We are so excited to be in person for this event because we know how much it means for we know how much it means for you to be together, learning and sharing with one another, and we hope that many of you will join us. For many of you, Duluth is pretty close, so we hope you'll give it some consideration. One of the exciting offerings this year that we're thrilled has come to fruition is a job hiring event. Once again, we are working with our Forest Service partners and the agency's human resources staff to bring attendees and others this important opportunity. Forest Service staff will be on hand to talk to prospective employees about job openings within the agency on Wednesday, September 7th and Thursday, September 8th. They are especially eager to talk to students and recent graduates, but not limited to these folks. For those who can't attend the conference, the event will be virtual as well. Or if you do live close to Duluth, or it's not too far of a drive for you, Thursday, September 8th, will be an open house where non-attendees are welcome to visit in person. Registration for the conference is open, and early bird rates are available until the end of July. All of the information is on our website, so spend a little bit of time there and learn more. And we hope to see many of you in Duluth this September. Another program element that NAA offers is its Stewardship and Action field workshops. We're working with our partners at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Scientific and Natural Areas program to showcase a very successful model in private-public conservation that has resulted in significant prairie protection in Minnesota. Fragmented Prairies and Grasslands, Reconnecting Habitats Through Collaborative Partnerships is an in-person workshop and will be held July 19th through the 21st of this year. So just in a few weeks, and that will be held in southwestern Minnesota. During the workshop, we will visit 7 prairies and explore various grassland conservation and management strategies, along with partnerships required to make them successful. We have practitioners registered from many of the tallgrass prairie states for this field tour. It's a fantastic example of partners coming together to offer a small, intimate workshop where learning and sharing results results in great outcomes for land managers. There are a few spaces left, so check out our website at naturalareas.org for more information. And if you don't get in, know that we will be filming this workshop in the hopes of exposing more than the in-person attendees to great natural areas conservation work. On that note, I want to emphasize that the purpose of today's symposium is for land management practitioners to understand how to effectively partner with one another while considering co-management of tribal lands. The focus will be on collaboration strategies and opportunities, highlighting new learning and exploring challenges. While we understand that there are multiple perspectives surrounding these topics, we will not be addressing issues and questions outside of the purpose of this program. But if you do have questions beyond today's focus, we encourage you to email Keith Karnes or Jen Youngblood directly, and you'll be hearing from both of those folks in a moment. Maura will provide you their email addresses, and we thank you in advance for honoring this request. So it's time to start the program. However, before we do get into the presentations and introductions, and even though we are not convening this workshop in person, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous people who have actively conserved and protected the natural resources of the Chippewa National Forest for centuries, including all Minnesota Chippewa tribes and currently the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, who recognize this area as their homeland. The idea for this program began almost 2 years ago, but as with many things, COVID-19 delayed making it a reality. Originally, this was supposed to be an in-person workshop. However, the fluidity of the pandemic and the desire to share this information with a wide audience led to a decision to rethink the program as a virtual symposium. Today, we're shining a light on co-management between the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and the USDA Forest Service. This relationship is unique due to the overlap of the homelands of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and the USDA Forest Service, honoring treaty rights and sovereignty. A memorandum of understanding was established to create a shared decision-making model between the band and the Forest Service to advance shared priorities and projects on a landscape scale across shared boundaries. Signed in October of 2019, the MOU is still fairly new, and I'm sure that our presenters today will share many insights as to the understanding and framework from the MOU as it was put into practice. We as an organization are proud to support programming that can potentially help others to build relationships and embrace the traditional practices of the original land stewards. As part of today's program, we will not only hear from individuals who represent the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and the USDA Forest Service, but we will also learn about the ongoing projects within this shared landscape. We hope that this symposium will not only offer new learning and knowledge sharing, but will inspire you to find ways to collaborate with tribal nations and agency partners in your area. I'd also like to take a moment to thank 2 people who were instrumental in developing this program and agenda and working very closely with the NAA. A big shout out to Todd Tisler. Todd is the Fish and Wildlife Program Manager for the USDA Forest Service on the Chippewa National Forest. And Micah Raber, who is the Renewable and Resources Staff Officer for the Forest Service on the Chippewa National Forest. Without their assistance and support, this program would not have been possible. So thanks to you both very much. It's my pleasure to introduce our 2 opening speakers at this point, Jen Youngblood and Keith Karnes. Jen Youngblood is currently the first Deputy Forest Supervisor on the Chippewa National Forest in Minnesota. She is a native of what is now known as the state of California and has lived in both Alaska and Wisconsin. Prior to the Forest Service, Jen had a diverse background serving as a registered nurse in forensic investigations, law enforcement, and as an adjunct professor of environmental science at Carroll University. Previously, Jen owned a consulting firm and until 2013 conducted work in many Arctic nations prior to her federal career. Jen holds multiple degrees, including 2 undergraduate degrees, registered nursing and environmental science and chemistry with a physical geography minor. She holds a master's degree in adult education and a doctor of jurisprudence with an emphasis on natural resource law and federal Indian law, which was conferred on her in 2012 before realizing her Forest Service career. She also believes in paying it for, oh, I'm sorry, forgive me, I just skipped an important note. Jen believes in honoring the federal commitment to tribes and herself as an interesting path, owing her experiences to honoring the wisdom and words of her great-grandmother and grandmother. She also believes in paying it forward by collaborating, mentoring, and sharing ideas with others to forge strong relationships and to facilitate achievement of land management goals to sustain the nation's forests and grasslands for future generations. Keith Karnes is forest director for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and earned his bachelor's degree in forestry from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point in 2003. Since 2006, when he began working for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, Keith has been blending the best available science with traditional ecological knowledge to make things work in today's world. In 2017, the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council appointed Keith to the Minnesota Forest Resources Council as the tribal affairs representative. And as forestry director, Keith is deeply committed to the Leech Lake Band's tribal ideology, which holds resiliency, adaptability, and biodiversity and balance as key tenets. As Keith explains, tribes as a whole, they look at the forest much more holistically. Traditional indigenous homelands are still homelands today and should be managed accordingly. Band members look at super canopy trees as elders that they are related to. Stories have come down through the generations about tribal members. They don't live in the forest, they are the forest. They are the wildlife. These are all one family and they're all together. Everything has its part. And I think that says it all. Jen and Keith, please take it from here.
A little bit before we really get going, we want to talk about the historical background of the Chippewa National Forest and the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and how the lands interact. This area, this national forest was the only one that was ever created for the benefit of the Indian people. And I know that it says it was created from Indian lands, but any national forest really, if you think back to it, all of it has been created from Indian lands. But this one was set aside. It was brought up by the League of Women Voters, who brought it up that they saw that there were too many trees that were being harvested and too many of the big ones are being harvested, and they wanted to preserve some of these for the indigenous people that lived up here. So that's the history of how it started way back then, 1908, and then moving forward. Next slide, please. Over the years, we have had concerns. You know, I mean, what is the Forest Service's trust responsibility here, where we have more shared boundary lines than anywhere else in the state with the national forest. Timber harvest has always been an issue. We're going to get into that a little bit later, and I'm going to show you why it's been an issue to the tribe. And we would have these discussions. They're meant to be meaningful discussions, but they've been more of just discussions early on, where consultation would be the Forest Service coming over, we're going to do this project, and now we've talked to you, like it was a checkbox. And so now we're realizing that some of the issues we were having is a lot of the people here, they weren't speaking the U.S. Forest Service jargon. They weren't speaking in boards and chords, talking about basal area, A lines, B lines, and this, that, and the other thing. And the focus was on timber extraction, and what is the overall vision, that they're bringing to this as part of their trust responsibility. So we wanted to get into that, and then we wanted to get into start creating a decision-making model, and that's something Jen is going to get more into that as we go forward here. But getting ownership of decisions from both governments, true ownership of decisions, not a decision from one side and some words from the other. I mean, it has to be an even playing field. So a lot of this culminated in 2016 when Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, they sent a letter to DC to the Forest Service chief. And once he got that, and we were talking about how we didn't feel like the Chippewa National Forest was truly holding up their trust responsibilities. They weren't paying attention to how we felt about the timber extraction. And the Forest Service chief sent a response letter. And I think, Jen, you're going to take it now.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. So let me begin by providing a bit of history as to why and what of this commitment, as it was directed by the chief to the region and the Forest Service to create this MOU. So as Keith mentioned, after the Forest Service Washington office received a letter from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, the Chief Tidwell, who was our previous chief in September of 2016, sent a letter back to the band, to the chairman of the Leech Lake Band. And really what this letter did is it included a commitment to develop this shared decision-making model for commercial timber harvesting and other natural resource considerations. And the chief agreed to work with the band using traditional ecological knowledge offered by the band and to expand the use of Tribal Forest Protection Act work to give voice to the band's land management objectives. And so you understand that really this is not anything new in the Forest Service. This MOU was not the first Forest Service tribal MOU in the agency. In the Eastern region, there's probably at least a minimum of 50 to 75 MOUs that we work with. And what these MOUs, and this one in particular, was it's a commitment that the Forest Service has made demonstrating that we intend to honor our federal trust responsibility. And so, like Keith said, the history of the Chippewa National Forest, it was initially designated between 1902 and 1908 from the Morris Act of 1902 as the Minnesota Forest Reserve. And there's specific language in that act that does talk about the creation for the benefit of Indian people. Then we moved to 1908, the Minnesota Forest Act of 1908, and that also was to create jobs, economic prosperity, and to also create the forest that was managed by the USDA Forest Service. And so this is really the only national forest in the agency that was created by statute. And when the forest was created, this meant that approximately 90% of the reservation is now found within the proclamation boundaries of the forest, and about 45% of the forest lies within the reservation boundaries. And this continues today. So it creates this very unique land-based situation. And so this unique overlap of boundaries has provided a really unique opportunity to implement a shared stewardship strategy, as well as enhance the federal responsibility to Indian nations, which require the federal government and its representatives to support tribal self-governance and economic prosperity. So these legal responsibilities stem from the US government's treaty guarantees to protect Indian tribes and respect their sovereignty. So as we started having discussions in 2016 on this MOU, it was November of 2016, it took 3 years with the Forest Service, working with the band, the regional office, the Washington office, and really incorporating the voice of our Office of General Counsel to look at our guiding laws, our rules and authorities to create this MOU, which was signed by the regional forester and the chairman of Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe in October of 2019. So again, it wasn't an overnight process, it was a very quick process. And so again, to get this MOU signed and to begin, long-term implementation, there were many, many steps in the process which were taken into consideration, including correlation to the forest plan. We have looked at DVCs, our desired vegetative conditions 1 through 5, and bringing them in. The creation of a shared decision-making model at the behest of the chief, which outlined a joint planning process incorporating NEPA, cooperating agency status, really intensive tribal consultation and collaboration, and really the practice of legal dispute resolution and how we would move forward if we weren't falling into some kind of place where we could agree or agree to disagree. And so as I talked about this shared decision-making model in the MOU, one thing I want you all to know is this language does not mean that the Forest Service can ignore the band, or the Leech Lake band can override Forest Service decisions for the Chippewa National Forest. But what it does mean is that the forest and the band are going to work collaboratively to develop objectives that aim to protect treaty resources and to meet the Chippewa Forest Plan objectives. And so again, implementation of this MOU has been an ongoing process for the past 3 years and has incorporated tribal and forest needs to manage and or protect tribal resources as needed. And we've been working together towards implementation of the MOU. And in this process, the forest has found that much of what is in the MOU was already being utilized on our forest projects. We were doing things, it's just kind of codifying them now. So one example of how this implementation has moved forward is that Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe has become much more active in the NEPA process, hence creating collaborative discussions between the forest and the band as we talk about and as we work with desired vegetative conditions, the forest plan, and all the other structures identified in the MOU. Next slide, please. So in the 2016 Chiefs letter, there were really 4 key points that I want to focus on, 2 of these points for this conversation today. These areas are the desired vegetative conditions correlated to the forest plan and the agency's desire for a shared decision-making model with the band. And so together, the forest and the band have worked to develop objectives that aim to protect treaty resources, as well as, again, as I said earlier, assisting the Chippewa National Forest to meet forest plan goals, standards, and objectives. And in this shared decision-making model, it outlines a joint planning process, incorporating several of our guiding laws and practices. And these are similar to what I mentioned earlier, the NEPA process, or the National Environmental Protection Act, cooperating agency status, and I'm going to discuss that a little bit more in depth shortly, along with extensive tribal consultation, collaboration, and our legal dispute resolution process. And so one thing I want to share about this is I was not on the forest, but I was in the regional office. So I've been able to see this process as it started and see how it's evolved and been part of these conversations. And what I want to share is the MOU was designed with several things in mind. One, really meeting our legal responsibility to the band. That was kind of the foundational piece, but also improving agency and forest efficiencies to meet the requirements of NEPA, and then really to better address overall the tribal concerns on the reservation through formal consultation and collaboration on forest management projects where we have that overlap, as well as those treaty ceded territories to have those conversations. And so one thing in this process I want people to know as well is when we engage other groups such as industry and other forest users, the Forest Service continues to be committed to this engagement with all of our other users. And this MOU has not diminished or should not have affected those opportunities for engagement with any other users. It's just a difference in the legal responsibilities we have to the government to government or nation to nation relationship codified in law and treaty, as well as being a multi-use agency serving all of our users and making sure that we are meeting the Forest Service mission to serve the public. And so one thing we've done is the Forest Service is committed to continue. We've started holding quarterly calls with industry. We're committed to continue holding those and keeping the lines of communication open with other user groups. So, and there remain those opportunities which have always been provided for full engagement on projects as requested and needed in alignment with what we're doing to honor our federal fiduciary responsibility to the band and honor the MOU. Next slide, please. So this might get a little boring and I don't want to dive too deep because that's the law in me, but I want to explain just a little bit of the legal context of what drives the MOU. First, we need to think about the original treaties made by and between the United States and Indian tribes. And the treaty period in this country spanned almost 100 years of the colonial period of US history lasting from 1789 to 1871. And during this time, over 500 treaties were signed. And so this is kind of the foundational piece that we need to think about of what is driving this MOU and the relationship, this unique relationship between the Forest Service and the band. It's these treaties that, and ensuing federal Indian law that has been created, that really creates and sets forth this legal relationship that's unique between the federal government and Indian tribes. And like I said, treaties form that foundation of this relationship. And the treaties have helped define all of these federal tribal relationships since the Supreme Court's earliest decisions. And it's codified through the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. It's found in 30 U.S. 116 and 1831 in the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. Chief Justice Marshall basically acknowledged that treaties were what set forth the definition of tribes as domestic dependent nations, and creating that relationship and that responsibility from the federal government to recognize tribes as a people and as nations and having unique legal status in this country. Next slide, please. So this is, Keith and I wanted to provide you with just kind of a quick visual of what some of the areas considered in this shared decision-making model language of the MOU was. And you can see it's very, it's very specific. We have natural resource management, economic development and employment, training and education, maintaining the Ojibwe cultural lifeways, and then regulatory jurisdiction. Much of these things in the shared decision-making model MOU also are the work we do as the Forest Service. We serve all the public. So everything that we do is dovetailed together to make sure that we're honoring this unique legal responsibility to the band, but we're also providing resources for everyone else of the American public that uses our resources. Next slide, please. And again, this is another visual of the shared decision-making model. And what I want to do is, I talked a little bit about trying to make sure we're having regular meetings, regular communication, but this is another visual of the shared decision-making model. And I want to bring your attention to the quarterly updates. We do these, this is part of the responsibility to have these quarterly updates between the Forest Service and the band. And these are really important updates. But know that we also do a monthly formal consultation under the MOU, which there's this constant communication. And again, the bands are really participating in key meetings. They're coming to the table early in our IDT meetings for NEPA or interdisciplinary teams. And as I said earlier, I'm going to talk a little bit about cooperating agency and that participation that's codified in law. Next slide, please. So when we talk about cooperating agency, this is a big part of what this MOU really is addressing as well. Not just the shared decision making, but how does it look when the Forest Service and the band are communicating and working through something that needs to happen. And again, it's tied to the forest plan. So it's kind of this whole moving process. And so know that under 40 CFR 1501 7 sub E, a cooperating agency only qualifies a state, a tribe, or a local agency of similar qualifications to become a cooperating agency with the agreement of the agency lead. And so it's not just anyone can become a cooperating agency, but when we talk about under 40 CFR 15018 and cooperating agencies, this emphasizes agency cooperation early in the NEPA process, which is what this MOU has set forth. And then again, having a state, a tribe, a local agency of similar qualifications becoming a cooperating agency by agreement with the Forest Service. And so that was something that the MOU codified. Our implementation of the MOU is addressing, our conversations are addressing, and it's allowing us to honor that unique legal relationship. And so at the bottom of this slide, you'll see a list of where it says, basically Leech Lake shall. And that language is directly from 40 CFR 1508.8 subsections B, 1, 3, and 5. That isn't something that we just pulled out, but that is codified in the CFR. Next slide, please. So we've got a lot to talk about today. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this portion by sharing with you that, when I was in the regional office and I was part of this process from a different lens, there's a lot of sides of this and a lot of thought, consideration, collaboration that really went into the development of this MOU. It wasn't done in a vacuum. And, for those of you that know or don't know, the Forest Service is definitely a recognized leader among federal land management agencies in partnering really appropriately and collaboratively with American Indian and Alaska Native tribal governments. And it's not the individuals, it's about the collaboration with the governments for the better of the community. It's like what we say, for the greatest good, for the greatest number. And so everything really, we all have a conservation ethic, everyone on this call. And so that's really where this has come. Also, some of this has come from the heart, is the conservation ethic. And so the Eastern region also demonstrates the highest standards for support of tribal sovereignty, the recognition of Indigenous values as shared values in our work, protection of reserved rights and cultural properties, consultation and collaboration, and really being not just government to government relationships, but partners and deep partners in landscape scale conservation across many of our users and collaboratively with everyone involved. And so I'm going to wrap it up here. The federal government, just so you know, has trust responsibility of 574 recognized Native American tribes. The Forest Service chief in 2016 made this commitment through his letter to the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe to honor their treaties, the Forest Service mission, and fulfilling Forest Service trust responsibility. So additionally, we at the Forest Service and everyone across the federal government is working with new executive orders from the current administration to recognize trust responsibilities and to strengthen these relationships between federal agencies and tribal nations. The current administration is committed to upholding the United States trust responsibility to these nations, strengthening the relationship between the United States government and Indian tribes, and working to empower tribal nations to govern their own communities and make their own decisions by strengthening the nation-to-nation relationship. They also have asked federal agencies to help restore tribal lands, address climate change, and safeguard natural and cultural resources while expanding economic opportunity and community development in Native communities, as well as all of our local communities. So we have a really big lift on our plate to really help, especially in these challenging economic times. But I wanted to share with you just a few of these federal priorities as we move forward working with tribal nations. So I want to say thank you for listening, and I've provided the why and what of the MOU process. Now I'm going to turn it back to Keith to talk about the how of the MOU implementation and our ongoing work with DVCs, Tribal Forest Protection Act projects, 638 contracting with the Forest Service, and all kinds of other exciting things. So take it away, Keith. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jen. Jen covered all the political stuff. I'm glad she did that. She's way better at it than I am. Next slide, please. So what is a healthy forest? That's the question. That's the first thing that was coming up. And if you look at the map that's on here, even though it's kind of squished, we were always saying that timber harvest is excessive on the Leech Lake Reservation. And if you look here, there's a mill in Bemidji that does pine studs. There's a mill in Grand Rapids that does pulp. So there's a lot of pine and a lot of aspen going out. And if you tried to put the Leech Lake Reservation any better into that 50-mile overlap, I don't think you could. I mean, so there is something to be said there that, the timber coming off the Leech Lake Reservation was definitely excessive, trying to meet the needs of the local mills. And that's not the belief that the Leech Lake people were trying to bring forward. When I graduated college a lifetime ago, I was taught that a healthy forest, it's insect and disease free. You got all these healthy trees, and a monoculture is a good idea. That's what they taught me. Growing space, you want to keep it below the A line. You want to keep it above the B line. They teach you these things. Ecologically, I've learned now over the years, I've had good teachers. I've seen Brian's on here. Brian is very steeped in it. You'll hear from him later. A true forest, a healthy forest is far beyond that. Next slide, please. So one of the mandates that came down from the chief of the Forest Service was to have the tribe draft these desired vegetative conditions. And when we did that, we didn't want to pin ourselves into a corner. So we wanted to have these goals be broad, be landscape, go across property lines, to cover all the areas where tribal members retain treaty rights. We wanted to try to find as best we could a crossover between traditional ecological knowledge and the best available science, the Western science, which is the language that the Forest Service is going to understand. And we bring that in there. And again, reflect tribal priorities. Next slide, please. So we came up with 8 DVCs. You can see them on here, but I like the next slide better. So let's go to the next one. If we take them and we can break them up into 3 different categories. We got a cultural category where we're going to protect the cultural integrity of Leech Lake. Culture is ongoing. I mean, there's a lot of people that figure culture, give it a time. Was it 50 years ago? Was it 100 years ago? Culture is still happening today. Cultural identity still exists today, and impacts to traditional cultural properties and threatened and endangered species are impacts to this cultural identity because of a holistic viewpoint. The ecological category, which is the one that I spend most of my time dealing with, we wanted the Forest Service, they got their blocks of functioning old growth stands. It doesn't mean that the trees are gigantic, but it does mean that there are old growth characteristics there. I mean, you could have a 3,000-year-old forest that all the stems on it are no bigger than your little finger, but it can have those characteristics of old growth. Maintaining and protecting diverse hardwood stands. There's a lot of simplicity on the Chippewa National Forest with between pine plantations and aspen monocultures, which begged for the Aspen Initiative. And, a lot of these are being done in areas where there would have been diverse hardwood stands, so we're looking at native plant community classifications to see what should be there and kind of what abundance should be there of different species, and trying to find this diversity, not just in species, but also in age. And then restoring conifers to ecologically functioning systems. We have a ton of pine plantation up here. You hear it referred to as a biological desert, and it's maximizing the growing space in timber and not allowing any of the growing opportunity to occur below that. And you end up with hazel and very little else. And it's not ecologically functioning. I would wager I'm right with that, Brian. And then the last category is environmental justice. There have been requests made by Leech Lake as the Chippewa National Forest is coming in for projects, and Leech Lake would say, we want this. And the Chippewa National Forest would say, great, we can do that. And then down the road, well, that never happened. And we would ask why, and we would say, well, something came up. We weren't able to do it, so we just did something else. So I mean, it's a life rule that we're taught from a young age. I mean, if you say you're going to do it, do it. It's simple, and they're meant to be simple. Protection of scenic corridors. I mean, we have the Western version. you know, what is a scenic corridor? I mean, well, you got all the major highways, of course. You got scenic highway. Well, that's, you know, it's a scenic corridor because it's actually in the name of the highway. But scenic corridors go far beyond that on the reservation. There are travel routes that were historically used that need to also be protected, you know, and that gets to be the goal. Kind of everything could almost be a scenic corridor. Next slide, please. So those were the DVCs. And the other thing I'm going to weigh heavy on here is the Tribal Forest Protection Act. It was put in by Congress in 2004 as there were large fires in California that were starting on either Forest Service land or Bureau of Land Management lands. And you can imagine, I mean, as they're going uphill and they get raging, it doesn't matter how good a work you do on reservation lands. If that fire gets raging enough, it's going to cross the line and it's going to burn up tribal timber, tribal forests. And that's what was happening in California. So this Tribal Forest Protection Act came out largely for fuels. And it allows the reservations to look across the line and say, look, Bureau of Land Management or Forest Service, we don't think you're doing a good enough job here. So we're saying we think you should do this, and this is how, and it comes through the form of a letter, and it's signed by the reservation and sent. We send ours to the supervisor's office, and from there it goes to the regional office. The regional office needs to approve these. Somebody, when they created this act, they went beyond just fuels, and they said if the land is in need of restoration, which is the portion of this act that we have grabbed onto full force. Next slide, please. So we have to date 5 Tribal Forest Protection Act projects that have been approved by the region. We have 2 of them that were red pine, white spruce thinning ones. We started out small. The idea that anything new, I mean, people are going to be cautious. It's kind of scary. So we started out small, you know, and let everybody kind of dip their toes in, see how they felt about it. And once there was a comfort level, then we blew it up into this full scale, saying that any of your pine, and we use the years between 20 and 40 years old, when you still have live crown on there and you're still getting growth from it, these stands were getting far, far too dense. And they were starting to lose their live crown. And we're saying, you have to get in there earlier. You have to thin them early, thin them often, and retain that live crown, and ultimately end up with these missing across the landscape. We had a project, when I was speaking to our other wildlife biologist, I see Tanya's on here, Steve Mortenson's our other one. I was telling him that TFPA can work for other departments. And he asked me, well, how would it work for wildlife? I told him, pick a topic. And he brought up snowshoe hare habitat expansion. And Tanya's going to go far more in depth on this than I am. So I'm just going to skip over that one then. Aspen is the 800-pound gorilla here on the Leech Lake Reservation. It's the easiest to manage. I mean, a 5-year-old can manage an aspen stand. You know, all you got to do is cut it and wait, and then cut it again. And it's a highly marketable species. So it's really popular. There's a lot of aspen. There's every agency up here says there's too much aspen. They have too many acres of aspen, but nobody will do anything about it. Years ago, I was at a regional landscape committee meeting, and there was an older forester there, and he said he would go into these stands with nice aspen, 10, 12-inch aspen, perfect to go to the mill. And he would look at it and say, well, it should be something else. How can I get it to become something else, the something else that it wants to be? He said he'd rub his chin whiskers and think about it. And then ultimately just, you know what? I'm just going to cut it, and I'm going to let the next guy worry about it. And people laughed. But there's a lot of truth said in jest. You know, there's a lot of people that do that because it is difficult. Aspen is very vigorous. it'll take over an area in a New York minute. And the last one that we got approved was our fire ecology, fire restoration TFPA, which a lot of these red pine white spruce thinning projects, these plantations are growing on lands that are keyed through the native plant community classification as fire dependent lands. Dependent, you know, they don't just want it, desire it, they're dependent. And in areas where fire hasn't happened in over 100 years, that forest is not allowed to do what it wants to do. We have out year ones that we're looking at doing, and we just haven't done them yet. You know, and we'll probably get to them. Next slide, please. So the snowshoe hare one that I referred to is basically, it's just trying to link snowshoe hare from one white cedar stand to another and creating habitat in between. I'm just going to pass on that for now. I'm going to let, I don't want to steal Tanya's thunder, so I'm going to skip over that one now. Next slide, please. Our TFPA pine spruce restoration. You know, this started in 2016. And if you look at the map here, when we expanded it to cover nearly the 16,000 acres of red pine and white spruce plantation located inside the Chippewa National Forest, there's a lot of it. And you can see in between Lake Winnebagosh and Cass Lake, there's a concentration of red, a concentration of these red pine stands. That was an area that we pulled out for its own unique project that we've called the Sand Plains Pine Project, which we're going to get into later. And some of the actions we're doing, I mean, again, we're telling the Chippewa National Forest, you need to thin these earlier. And that's inherent in just about every agency up here. I mean, they wait too long when the live crown gets down to 10 or 20%. I mean, those trees are done. They're not going to do anything anymore. Keep that live crown at 50, 60% and just let it go forward. You know, and realizing that the growing space in there shouldn't just be maximized for tree growth. You know, historically, there were fruiting shrubs that grew out there. There were blueberries that all fruited out there. There is wildlife that relied on various different kinds of forests. All of that needs to be taken into account. It isn't just the maximization of growing space for trees. Next slide, please. This is the Sand Plain Pine Project that I referred to. That's that heavy concentration of red stands that were in between Lake Winnebagosh and Cass Lake. We'll get into that in a later discussion today. But it's been a wonderful pilot project for working together with the CHIP. It's been one where I know Jen has worked on it. Todd Tisler, I assume he's on here. He's been integral in working on this. You know, there's been a lot of people cutting their teeth on this project. Next slide, please. The last TFPA that we had was fire restoration. If you look at the map here, I don't have the exact acres, but you can see the stands that are categorized as fire dependent. It's a lot. It's something that's missing, you know, and ever since the 70s or even before the 70s, I mean, when Smokey the Bear was coming out and he was, you know, only you can prevent forest fires. Everybody said he can't have fires in the woods. You know, and it's, in my mind, it's grown to be probably the #1 thing that is missing from the forests on the Leech Lake Reservation is fire. You know, it was a management tool that's been used since time immemorial, and it needs to be brought back again. And it's been in excess of 100 years in many of these areas since there's been a fire because of the push to put fires out as soon as they happen instead of letting them do what they're going to do. And how much of a crown can you afford to lose? You know, there's the Forest Service has kind of glommed onto a number. Just about every agency has glommed onto a number of 10%. And I would say if it exceeds that, so what? It's what nature would have done. our wildlife guy would say some of these areas that get burnt over and turn into these jackstraw piles of burnt timber, that's a wildlife mecca. It's a regeneration forest mecca. You know, so viewing things through a different lens is something that needs to happen. You know, changing the paradigm on why wood is cut needs to happen. You know, instead of we need to provide wood to the local mills as the number one, the driving idea. Change the paradigm. The wood going to the mill becomes a means to the end, where ecological restoration becomes that end in and of itself. Next slide, please. So then we took, in 2018, the US Farm Bill came out with the ability for tribes to enter into 638 contract authority with the USDA. To do that, you had to have a TFPA project, which again, we had numerous ones. And this was pushed very hard by the Intertribal Timber Council. And they actually called me after that farm bill came out and said, there's 10 pilot projects in here. We want you to do one of them because you have so many of these, you're doing good things. So we've recently entered into one now. Next slide, please. We've recently entered into one using our original TFPA project, our small, dip your toes in the water, 48-acre overdense pine thinning that we did. Had a very high basal area, the live crown was declining, hazel was everywhere. We thinned that in 2016 under our TFPA. We removed the brush in 2017 under TFPA. We've pursued a grant, a Reserve Treaty Rights Lands grant, and we brushed it again in 2020. So now we've taken it and we've entered this into a 638 contract, and we're calling it phase 2. And what phase 2 is now we're going to come in and we're going to thin it again. And we're going to focus on the non-pine species. We're going to try and free those up a little bit to become a component of the canopy of this forest. That's phase 2. We're going to run a fire following this thinning. We're going to run a fire across there to begin to restore fire to the area. And then we're going to seed it with some native seed over half of the project and leave the other half to naturally come up and see, has this seed source, does it still exist? Or is it gone? It's an interesting thing that I would like to see. I mean, if you don't have a fire for 100 years, does that seed source, is it still persisting in the ground? I don't know. There's a lot of questions. As we call it a phase 2, there's a phase 3, but that's another story. Next slide, please. So as we move forward in this this new era, I guess, of collaboration and co-management, things that we found is, I mean, you need support from both sides. You know, this isn't a one-sided venture. I mean, people need to earnestly buy into this, and you need to push. And again, what you say you're going to do, do it. You know, honesty, integrity. I mean, these things they're simple. They're simple life traits that people have, and it just needs to be pushed forward. You know, on our TFPA, we started small. The pine spruce thinning TFPA, the snowshoe hare one. Once that one's done and it shows success, and I think it will, Tanya, then we can expand that, and we can do a reservation wide or even a forest wide, you know, and start including all these things. You know, we have pine spruce thinnings on top of fire dependent areas that have snowshoe hare habitat going into them. Multiple projects on the same exact tract of land. That's the tribal ideology. That's the holistic way of thinking. It's keeping everything in consideration and not just looking at the canopy and saying, sweet, I'm between the A and the B line. How good am I? Next slide, please. And you know, we've had these outcomes. I mean, we get along. The meetings when we have between the CHIP and the tribe, when I first started here, there was a lot of tension when those meetings would happen. You know, now people come into the room. I mean, I was joking with Jen yesterday about being a Packer fan. You know, it's this simple humanity, and just, you know, we need to get along before we can work together. And getting along, that's a key thing. You know, I mean, understanding what makes people tick. The management practices, you know, again, that begs into the whole changing the paradigm. You know, we're pushing for ecological health. Instead of economic rotation, we're pushing for ecologic rotation. Species, you know, the snowshoe hare is a keystone one. If you build it, they will come. If you build the snowshoe hare habitat, the other species are going to prosper as well. And that potential to scale up projects and start overlapping one on top of the other. Next slide, please. These are the next steps. You know, I mean, and they're ongoing. I had most of my day yesterday was dealing with the chip. Most of my day today will be dealing with the chip. I deal with the chip daily, multiple hours a day. We're moving into dealing with the state and local governments. I sit on the Minnesota Forest Resource Council, where I deal more with elected officials down there. Some of the Forest Service staff deal with those folks more than I do. We both deal with forest products industry. Some of this work that we're doing as co-management is very scary to the forest products industry. They don't know how it's going to shake out. That's another story as well. Non-governmental organizations. I mean, we've also brought into the fold the Nature Conservancy, done a lot of work with the Nature Conservancy in recent years. And then partners and stakeholders. Stakeholders is always an interesting word to me. I see tribes often called a stakeholder or a special interest group, which is my personal favorite. I mean, people have a hard time embracing the idea that tribes truly are sovereign nations, and they need to be treated as such. It needs to be government to government, and that's changing. It's not just changing here; it's changing nationwide. You know, and then community presentations. I mean, we've had talks with the Chippewa National Forest about meeting with the local Indian councils. We've got 13 communities on the Leech Lake Reservation. And projects that are occurring in their area, that local Indian council needs to be made aware of it. And it needs to be explained in layman's terms. None of this A-level, B-level, basal area, codes for trees, none of that. You know, just talking person to person. You know, so we all live here together. Next slide, please. Now, as I wrap it up, Ben Benoit, he's our environmental director. This was an idea that he brought up numerous times, you know, that this isn't just a forest. There's a lot. For a long time, the Chippewa National Forest has looked at, well, this is my job. This is where I go and I'm Johnny Punch Clock and that's what I do. But it isn't just a forest, it's a homeland. You know, he said he would wake up and he was already at work because he lives inside the reservation. You know, his niece one time, they were going out in the woods for something. That's where I got that he said, so you ready to go out in the woods? And she said, I'm not going into the woods. I am the woods. And I hold that story dear. I mean, I think it's cute, you know, that this little girl is being brought up that she's not living in the woods, that she is actually an integral part of the woods. And those are different viewpoints that need to be embraced up here. I believe that's our last slide. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jen. And thank you, Keith. That was a great way to start this presentation today. We have a few minutes. We'll hit you with a couple of questions if that's okay. And I do encourage the audience to continue to post questions in chat. If you think of questions for both Jen and Keith, they will be with us through the day and at the end of the symposium. Keith, well, it's for either one of you, but we've promoted, I guess this might be better for Jen, you know, NAA has promoted this MOU as unique. But the question is, are there other MOUs between the Forest Service and tribes elsewhere in the US that you're aware of, Jen?
Yeah, there's many that are like, we have a 20+ year MOU with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. This MOU is unique in the fact that it is very specific to a shared decision-making model. And that was kind of some of the challenges and hiccups we ran into in creating this model, why we had to work with OGC so closely and our great legal scholars and minds in the agency to make sure that we were not overstepping our laws, rules, and authorities while we were trying to honor the federal trust responsibility to the band. And so this is a unique MOU in the fact that it was really one of the first clearly defined co-stewardship types of MOUs with the shared decision-making model. But there are numerous MOUs for relationships, work, honoring, certain responsibilities between the Forest Service to the tribes and the bands nationwide. But again, this also flows from the unique land base that we share, where we've got the overlay of, the forest and the reservation together. So,
excellent, thank you. Okay, we've got a question in from Liz Winlock. This is great information. How could smaller groups like urban park systems go about getting a collaborative consult relationship going with Native groups? Any suggestions, ideas?
Yeah, Liz, that's a great question. I appreciate that question because, we have like an Urban Connections program in the Forest Service. And like we've got a Urban Connections representative, Terry Hare, in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And so, she works with everyone who would be connected, in underserved communities in the greater Twin Cities area. But she also works with, Indigenous individuals who live in the Twin Cities. So you can do that a lot of in the Eastern region. I'm not sure where you're located, but in the Eastern region, we have representatives in St. Louis, in Chicago, in Boston. So if you're working with a smaller group or there is a tribal office, like in Milwaukee, there's SEOTS, which is the Southeastern Oneida Tribal Services, or you have Forest County Potawatomi. Some tribes will have offices to support their community members. And so you basically can work with Urban Connections, work with those communities to really engage with some of those Indigenous folks that aren't, as tied to their community as they would like to be for work purposes or family purposes or different things like that. So I hope that helps. And you're in Louisville. Yeah, I'm not sure if Region 8, but I'm sure, I think I saw Lexi Rue Harris on here. So, she is your tribal liaison in Region 8 for the region. So I would say reach out to Lexi Rue Harris and she can probably answer some questions or help you get connected, because I think I saw her on. And if you're on, hi, Lexi.
Fantastic.
Well, a couple of things I'd add to that, Liz, would be, come from a good place. If you're going to ask, I've run into areas where I've had people come and want us to sign on, like for grants, things like that, where it looks kitschy to have a tribe signed on, and it isn't. And they don't really care what we think about it. They just want to be able to put our name on there. So, come from a good place. And the way, is to listen. That's the number one thing that I could tell anybody is, if you're going to deal with a tribe, the first thing you need to do is listen. I always tell everybody that's why 2 ears, 1 mouth, right? You should listen twice as much as you talk. So, people will tell you, maybe not exactly, but they're going to tell you what they want, if you're truly listening to them. So
thank you for that, Keith. Great advice. I'm going to ask another question here, and I'm again encouraging the audience, but is Keith, you sort of started, at the end, as you were wrapping up, you were talking about outcomes. Is the general sense, and maybe it's too soon to tell, but the general sense from both the band and the forest that this MOU and this new approach to collaboration and co-management, is it resulting in positive outcomes from the standpoint of, if any of this work had been baselined, are you starting to see positive outcomes for conservation that are measurable, or is it a little bit too soon yet?
It's a little bit soon, but
Okay.
the initial project, the one that we've entered into a 638 with, I took a couple, are also on the Minnesota Forest Resource Council. I took them up there to take a look around. And we're seeing fruiting shrubs, Juneberry, raspberry, and then blueberries that are bearing fruit on that project now. They weren't there a few years ago. So, I mean, if you're looking, you're starting to see some benefit. Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, great, great. We have just a couple more minutes left before break, and another question comes in from Jenny Selgrath. Could you talk more about the process of integrating traditional ecological knowledge into management? It came up several times in the presentations. Is there anything you might be able to offer additional?
I think the best story I got for it is with the onset of climate change. You know, when you're getting that you need to be resistant, resilient to climate change. Right now, we were having a meeting with the Minnesota DNR, and this was 7-8 years back, maybe something like that.
Mhm.
And we were sitting down, and the DNR is like, well, maybe we need to diversify our forests a little bit to make them a little more resistant, resilient. And I started laughing. I said, yeah, tribes have been saying this for a long time. Everything has a part. Sometimes, your scrub oak, it still plays a part in the forest. This crooked birch tree that's growing on the side, it plays a part in the forest. That's what tribes have been saying for forever. And now the DNR is starting to realize, well, maybe there's some credence to that. But some people are slow learners.
Very, very good. So at this point, we're going to hold some of the questions for the final discussion as they come in. Jen and Keith, thank you so much. That was excellent. Thank you for kicking off the day. I think you've set beautiful context for the presentations that we're about to hear, and we look forward to seeing you both at the end of the session. And our next presenter is Tanya Roerick. Tanya is a wildlife biologist for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. She has a master's degree in wildlife science and has worked in the wildlife field for over 11 years, the last 4 of which have been for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. And in her work, Tanya manages various research and management projects on snowshoe hare, wolves, fishers, martens, double-crested cormorants, and other wildlife. It sounds like an amazing job. Tanya also collaborates with other agencies on wildlife habitat projects, game harvest, and the protection of TES species. Tanya, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing more about the Leech Lake Snowshoe Hare Habitat Project.
Thank you. So today I'm going to share with you our Snowshoe Hare project. And this project started out as a research project, then got turned into a TFPA. And now we're starting to do more of a landscape scale approach with this project. And so the reason, or first I should say, this has been largely supported by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Tribal Wildlife Grant, and then we've received additional support from the Forest Service, Chippewa National Forest, and Bureau of Indian Affairs. So the reason we started this project is because of how important snowshoe hare are to the Leech Lake Band. They're historically used as a food source and a fur source for tribal members, and they also support a lot of predators on the reservation. A lot of predators want to eat snowshoe hare. They're essentially the cheeseburgers of the forest. And some of those predators are even ones that are found on our TES list. Canada lynx is threatened. Fisher, marten, goshawk all eat snowshoe hare as a primary prey source. And those last 3 are on our TES list as well and are a management concern to the band. So it's really important to have a healthy hare population for cultural reasons and to support just a healthy, ecologically functioning forest. So snowshoe hare range across much of North America. Here in Minnesota, we're at the very southern edge of their range. And you might remember from like science classes back in school, they talked about like populations that cycled with highs and lows, and snowshoe hare are one of those. There's some debate in literature if if hare populations do still keep that cyclical pattern at the southern edge of their range. But here on the Leech Lake Reservation, we do still see that, at least historically. As we look closer to present, our snowshoe hare populations have remained extremely low. And so this has been noted by tribal elders, people who have worked on the Leech Lake Reservation for decades. And then also we start to pick up on some of that in some surveys. And this survey wasn't for hare in particular. It was actually, I think, for rough grouse. But in the red is Leech Lake, and you can see that Leech Lake is just consistently low in snowshoe hare populations. And that still remains consistent to this day. So this was really concerning to us. And we wanted to know, what is limiting snowshoe hare on the Leech Lake Reservation? And so we did this by determining habitat composition and structure in snowshoe hare home ranges, and then related that to their survival, their space use, and their interactions. And then most importantly, we wanted to see what could we do for snowshoe hare to help improve those hare populations on the reservation. And so we wanted to develop forest management guidelines to enhance snowshoe hare habitat. So to do that and to get that information we needed, we took a multi-scale approach. So at the landscape scale, we did occupancy surveys to estimate presence and absence across the forest. At the stand level, we looked at estimating snowshoe hare densities through pellet surveys. And then we looked at the home range scale by collaring individual hare and assessing habitat selection, and then also monitoring those individuals for survival. So I won't get into all the nitty gritty of how we did everything, all the results, but I do want to pull out some really key points to what led us to where we're at now with forest habitat management for snowshoe hare. So we collared 96 snowshoe hare throughout the duration of that project. 35 died, and about 91% of those were mortalities from predators. And this is likely a very conservative estimate. We had 25 collars just go missing on us, and that could have been collar failure. It could have been that they were predated on and something happened to the collar that we weren't able to recover it. But because we had such a high percentage of mortalities and just a small number, I guarantee a lot of more of those were mortalities by predators than what we were actually seeing. So then with our looking more at the habitat selection, we found that snowshoe hare selected areas with high visual cover. And this can be like coarse woody debris or different vegetation layers, just anything that hare can hide under to help protect them from predators. So hare rely on running from cover to cover to evade a predator. They can't just outrun it like some prey can. And so we're finding that 65 to 85% visual cover, and this is measured off a cover board, is ideal for hare, and that cover needs to be lifted up off the ground, ideally 100 to 150 centimeters. We also found that their core habitat is primarily in lowland conifer forests, specifically northern white cedar stands. And so those northern white cedar stands have these old growth characteristics that have lots of hiding cover for them. And so they're in these high quality core areas. And historically, we would see them start coming out from those areas because that secondary habitat still had hiding cover in it. And same when you start going further out. But now to this day, because of changes in forest, there's not that much structure out there for them to hide in, and they are just contained in these northern white cedar stands, not really branching out much from them. So this really isolates those populations, and if they can't, and a lot of times they blink out just because the area isn't large enough to have a stable hare population. So what we also found too was that a hare needs a hiding spot approximately every 20 or 12 feet is ideal. Like I said, they evade predators from going from cover to cover points. So the more hiding spots you have, the better for them. And so what we want to do is we want to start getting that cover to be further out than just and more than just those northern white cedar stands, so we can start seeing them in areas we haven't seen them in a very long time. So these next few slides are just to give you an idea of what we're looking for snowshoe hare habitat, what they find to be most ideal in their current habitat that they have now. And so a lot of it's coarse woody debris on the ground like this in this picture here, but there is a snowshoe hare in this picture if you want to take a minute to look for it. But this is a slash pile, and slash piles offer really great cover for snowshoe hare. Sometimes larger ones are better just because of different opportunities for them to seek refuge in them. And there's that hare. You can see a black little dot where its eye is, and that's where he's at. But it can also be as simple as just a downed log on the ground to help them blend into their surroundings. So we have a lot of different options of what to work with when you're trying to get snowshoe hare habitat out in the forest. This is another one that has a snowshoe hare out there, if you want to look for it. So conifers with low-hanging branches are really great cover for snowshoe hare. It gives them something to hide under and just, again, help them blend into their surroundings a bit more. And there's that hare right there. We're also finding that hare use tip-ups. It was just another structure in the forest that they found that they've been using, and it seems to work pretty well for them. So what we found is that winter seems to be the most limiting for snowshoe hare, especially with different snow depths. Some of those options for cover get buried by snow. So the more structure we can provide for them in their habitat, the better chance they have for survival at different points during the year. So in summer, we're still seeing them primarily concentrated to these northern white cedar stands, which is what you see here in the picture. But we do also start seeing them branch out from those cedar stands. The flush of green vegetation probably offers them some more cover in other areas of the forest that during leaf off time is not there. So the habitat we're primarily seeing next to these northern white cedar stands is almost all vertical in nature. You can look at this picture and it's hard to pick out just a couple of items for a snowshoe hare to hide under. And so there's definitely not something within 12 feet. There's definitely not something even within 20 feet. So this is really hard for snowshoe hare to survive outside those cedar stands when they have nothing to hide in. We're also working a lot with plantations, and these are this is a very extreme picture, but it is what we're working with. They're some of the worst areas just because of how they have been managed historically. They took a lot of the coarse woody debris out, and there's not a lot of stand diversity in those stands. We're also dealing with quite a bit of hazel out in the forest, and in the summer when it's leaved, it could maybe provide some aerial cover to snowshoe hare from predators. But if a fisher got into this, I mean, you can see there's nothing on the ground for a hare to hide under. So again, just getting more structure out in the forest is what seems to be the problem. We're really lacking it. So naturally, snowshoe hare habitat was created by stand replacing fires, blowdown, and coarse woody material. The problem is we no longer allow stand replacing fires. We salvage our blowdown, and there's not nearly the amount of coarse woody material out in the forest that there used to be. So this brings into question, like, what can we do for snowshoe hare, because we're no longer allowing snowshoe hare habitat to be naturally created. So we need to mitigate it in some other way. And so after some thought, and Keith brought this up in his presentation, why can't we manage the forest in a different way? Manage instead for wildlife, for snowshoe hare, and have timber as a byproduct of that. And so we started looking at ways we could start tweaking forest management to fit our objectives of snowshoe hare habitat enhancement. And some of that's just maintaining snags and coarse woody material during harvest. It's also increasing conifers with low-hanging branches. Balsam fir is really great for this, whether it occurs naturally or you need to plant it. And some feedback we've gotten on that as well, we're going to come back in here and harvest again in 5 to 10 years, and we're just going to run all that balsam fir over. And really, it's not that big of a deal. It's fine, because balsam fir is serving its purpose when it's at its younger stage for snowshoe hare. You need those low hanging branches for them to provide cover to snowshoe hare. And once they get older, they kind of lose their purpose to snowshoe hare. They no longer provide cover. And then it's really key to keeping coarse woody material up off the ground. Again, they need something to hide under. Having it flattened by machinery is doing them no good. And then retaining and promoting stand diversity. The more layers we can have in our stand, the more diversity. It gives different options for snowshoe hare cover. And then something we've been working with more are tree drops. This is just another way to get coarse woody material on the ground, and then also slash piles. And these can be of varying sizes, heights, but it just is another way to get more coarse woody material on the ground, more options for hiding cover for snowshoe hare. And so we really started to explore more at these slash piles. And before we went and suggested this to lot of other people, we wanted to make sure we weren't crazy with what we were suggesting. Would snowshoe hare actually use a man-made structure out of materials we would find in the woods? And so what we did is we set up cameras out within a half mile of cedar stands. And this was just because we figured our chances of a hare coming through that area was a bit higher than in other areas of the forest. And so we just put a camera there to start with, monitored it for a month. And then each month we would come back and we'd add some more structure to it. And we ended up with some nice little structures out there eventually. And in some cases, snowshoe hare found them the first night. In other cases, it took a couple months, but this is just a short video of a snowshoe hare using one of the sites here. And so this site in particular was used all winter. This hare hung out there. Other sites weren't used quite as long, but 5 out of the 6 sites that we had set out were used and were eventually found by snowshoe hare. So that seemed really promising to us that they will use these sites and that it is going to maybe do some good for them. We also found small mammals using the sites, a variety of different bird species. And then what was really interesting to us was that predators were keying in on these piles. And it meant to us that these probably weren't really frequently found on the landscape. To them, this was a place to find a meal. So the thought is, if we can create a lot of those piles across the landscape, make it a little bit harder for predators to find meals, but also still give them meals and also provide plenty of cover for small mammals and snowshoe hare, this could be really what we're working towards right here. So all of this research led to the Snowshoe Hare Tribal Forest Protection Act, which you'll hear me refer to going forward as the Hare TFPA. And it was again developed because of how important snowshoe hare are both as a cultural and keystone species to the Leech Lake Band. We wanted to demonstrate that we can create and enhance snowshoe hare habitat so that we could just not do a small project with this, but do it at a landscape scale, really try to build up our hare population and help wildlife as a whole, because more structure on the forest is going to help quite a few wildlife species. And so the thought is, if we can take those cedar stands, and there's a lot of them across the landscape on the Leech Lake Reservation, and we can start making them bigger so they can hold a stable hare population, that essentially was our goal. So we started looking for areas that we could expand upon and make those areas bigger, have more coarse woody debris. So the main problem we're having with our cedar stands is that they're small and they can't hold a stable hare population. And again, they can't branch out from there. So if we can build up the area around them and make that area bigger, we can have a stable hare population. We can create corridors to other cedar stands, other areas with more coarse woody debris, get more genetic flow, and just start seeing hare in parts of the forest that we haven't seen in a really, really long time. So this is the Hare TFPA site that was selected, and this site was selected because of the opportunities it provided us. You can see that there's 2 cedar stands relatively close together. We have a red pine stand, white spruce, and aspen. And so we can select a variety of management techniques to use in this area to demonstrate different things that we could do across the forest at a landscape scale. And so that red pine stand was just your typical more plantation style red pine, not much coarse woody debris out there. Same with the white spruce. Plantation, again, not much for coarse woody debris. The aspen stand was a little more unique. It was a little bit more diverse than we typically see for aspen stands. It had quite a bit of balsam fir in it, and it was older balsam fir. So this actually provided a really nice opportunity to do just tree drops, no harvest in the aspen stand, just tree drops, while the red pine and the white spruce would be receiving harvest. So that aspen stand, these are after treatment pictures. It's kind of hard to see the amount of debris that's on the ground, but we significantly changed this area. There is a lot more coarse woody debris out there. So what we did is we marked up to 20 trees per acre, and then the Chippewa National Forest Wildland Fire Crew came in and they cut those trees for us. And this was a really unique opportunity for both of us. We got to provide snowshoe hare habitat, and the fire crew had some really great opportunities for training with different trees that they could cut for their personnel as well. So then with that white spruce stand, we harvested a quarter of it. And then to bring it up to a third of trees being harvested, that extra little bit was reserved for tree drops at the end. So after harvest occurred. So while harvest was occurring, the cut to length machine would go in, take the log out, and instead of putting all the slash in the skid trail, they would instead pile it into slash piles. These are approximately 5 feet by 5 feet and about 5 feet tall as well. And they varied in sizes though too. I mean, you can't be that particular when you're working with different amounts of debris from each tree. And then they're spaced to approximately every 20 feet, some closer, some further apart. Again, it just kind of depended on the material provided, but it ended up turning out really, really nice. And so something we did during this process is we met with the logger beforehand, answered any questions he had. He told us any concerns he had. And one of the biggest ones was, is this going to take us a lot longer to harvest trees than what it would if they weren't doing all these slash piles? And what was really neat was that it really didn't take that much additional time. And we were still able to get timber out of the forest and provide wildlife habitat. So speaking to the logger after this project, it was definitely interesting to them. It was new to them, but it was something they were very willing to do again because it added minimal time and their machines could handle it. And it was something relatively easy to do. So this is really great moving forward that this could actually be done at a much bigger scale, and it's not a burden necessarily to do it. So this is the picture of the red pine stand after harvest. So the red pine didn't provide as much slash for us to work with for piles. So the piles are a little bit smaller, a little bit more spread apart. So a third of the stand was harvested and gaps were put into the stand as well. And this is just to open it up, hopefully getting some more vegetation growth, more diversity in that stand. And so again, it turned out great. It's better than having no piles at all. And that coarse woody debris is really being put to use for snowshoe hare in these areas. So big lessons learned from this is that it's possible to do this work. There is a lot of questions at the beginning, like, could this actually happen? Can we actually implement this at a landscape scale? And I think we really proved with this project that it's doable. And we learned too that just some small changes in harvest techniques go a long way for snowshoe hare. Like it's easy enough to create those piles, do some additional tree drops, maybe some other techniques we'll think of in the future. But just these small changes in harvest have really, really helped put more coarse woody debris and structure on the ground out there. And one thing that we really took away from this is that communication is key. It took a lot of people to make this project happen. The people in the photo down below are just probably a third of the people that came together to make this project possible. So this is one of the first really big projects we've had between Leech Lake and DRM and the Chippewa National Forest that really brought together wildlife biologists, silviculturists, foresters, timber folks, just really bringing everyone in together and planning this out from the beginning to end. And so we truly believe, after seeing this on the ground, that we can successfully provide habitat for snowshoe hare just through these changes in forest management techniques. So where we're at now is we're monitoring that Hare TFPA site. We did quite a bit of monitoring before the cutting and any kind of harvest occurred in those stands. And then now we're kind of in the post-harvest management. So to do that, we did a few different surveys. We did winter pellet surveys before treatment occurred. And this was done over a couple of years just to see our hare coming out of those cedar stands and using those stands that I showed you. And what we found is they weren't coming out of the cedar. The only time we are finding tracks and pellets out of those stands were right at the edge of cedar. So it'll be really interesting going into this next winter when we continue monitoring if hare start coming out of that cedar stand and start using that area that we created for them a bit more. Another monitoring method we've been using is looking and measuring at the amount of coarse woody debris that we've put out there. You may remember me saying we need 65 to 85% visual cover on a cover board. So that's something that we're doing now, that we did pre-management and now post-management. We're going out and we're surveying the area, making sure that we're actually getting the amount of coarse woody debris and structure out in the forest that we want to, that we wanted to begin with, or do we need more, or do we need less? So that's something that those monitoring activities will help us do. And then we're also looking at those slash piles. This is the first time we've done this. We have no idea how long they're going to last. We don't know how much they're going to maintain their integrity through the winter when they start getting heavy snow on them. So this is something that we're going to be going out. We're going to be measuring the height and how big they are, and just measure the compaction and how long they last in the forest. Because if they last longer than what we're expecting, which we think we can get probably around 5 years out of them, it could affect how we do future management. And it could also affect maybe other management that we want to occur there, say like a prescribed burn or something that could be too much fuel if our piles are lasting longer than we think they will. So just all things we need to think about and information we're gathering through different monitoring techniques. And then something my crew is also doing is we're surveying hare habitat enhancement opportunities across the forest. So we're looking to already, where can we go next? And so any stand that falls within a half mile of cedar stand, we're looking at what is the current condition of the stand? Is there hare sign in there? What management opportunities does that stand give us to work with? And so last year alone, we surveyed 36,000 acres, and there's still a lot more for us to do. And so now moving forward, we're starting to incorporate snowshoe hare habitat enhancement in all Forest Service vegetation projects. It's being looked at as another thing that we can incorporate to improve our forests on the Leech Lake Reservation. And we're also starting to approach other agencies to do similar work within the Leech Lake Reservation. We're starting to see success with this project. We know it's doable, and we want to start bringing on other partners to do this work. So again, I think snowshoe hare habitat management is something we can definitely do at a landscape scale across the reservation. And it seems really promising. And that's all I have. So if there's time for questions, I will take them.
Thank you, Tanya. That was really great. Okay, here we have a few questions coming in. Bear with me. Did you notice, this is from Travis Bartnick, did you notice if there were higher rates of predation during the times of the year when hare pelage color was white, but there was a lack of snow on the ground, that phenological mismatch he's referencing? Also, so that's the first part of the question. And then do you think there's any chance that the contrasting collar color, dark color on white pelage could potentially make hares more susceptible to predation?
Our predation rates did go up a little bit in October, November, when we were seeing color changes, and April, May. It's hard to say. It was a couple more hare than usual, basically. A lot of our hare got hit really hard during the middle of winter, and we're still not sure exactly why that occurred. So the color changes, yes, definitely a time when predation occurs a little bit more. We do think, though, if we could provide more structure out in our forest during those times and they had enough structure to hide under, that actually might alleviate some of those predations. That they would be safer out there. And then for the collar, I don't think it did. A lot of the collars, you could see them pretty well in the pictures, but for the most part, those collars are covered by hair, and they seem to blend in, like they're fluffy enough, especially in winter, where those brown and black collars didn't pop out as much. So I don't think it affected them getting predated on.
Great. And I may have missed this at the very beginning, but does your research include monitoring of how pelage color and, the phenology, the changes in phenology related to climate change are affecting hare populations in that northern part of the country?
So our research doesn't focus on that. It's something definitely we could include going forward, or even possibly look back on with, we've gathered a lot of data with this project, but we really focused on the forest habitat management. Just with our snowshoe hare populations being so low, it seemed like a really dire need to try to get more structure out in the forest, and that was our priority. But yes, it's definitely something to think about moving forward with climate change, that they are a highly susceptible species to climate change.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and then the next question from Melinda Neville. Cheeseburger of the forest, she puts in quotes. At what scale would these treatments need to affect a population level change for Wabuzog? And what does this mean for managing for wildfire?
So in the literature, it states that we probably need at least 50 hectares to have a stable hare population. And that's just like for one's area. And of course, we'd have these across the landscape. So I don't know for certain for our area, but the more we can build off of that, the more structure we can provide across the forest and start connecting those different habitats. That's going to be really key into saving snowshoe hare here. And how some of this stuff will affect prescribed burns. A lot of it is putting more structure out in the forest, and we have been talking to the wildland fire folks at the Chippewa National Forest with this. And in some cases, our piles would prevent them from doing prescribed burns. And that's something that we've been in really close contact with. I've actually removed some hare stands knowing that they're going to put fire there very soon, and that prescribed fire will also help snowshoe hare just with the flush of vegetation, trying to get those back to ecologically functioning forests. So it's definitely something that we have to weigh out our priorities and what would be best for that specific area. And it's really a stand by stand basis in some cases. So it's definitely something that's taking a lot of people to put this together. And yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to squeeze in one more question and then we'll hold John Pattons for the end of the session. How much revenue is kept back in the form of hare habitat?
That would be a good question for our Forest Service partners with this. So I did not deal with the revenue at all. So if any of them would want to jump on or put it in the chat, I'd appreciate it.
Excellent. Yeah, happy. Yeah, that's a great invitation. And we can also keep this I'll monitor. And if we can bring that up at the end, that might be helpful. But related to that, Gina Abramson also asks, does your funding cover that lost revenue? Can you expand on that? So do you think that might be a better question for Forest Service?
I think Forest Service will have to weigh in. So the Forest Service is actually the one that did the whole timber setup. So a lot of the funding that I brought in for this project through tribal wildlife grants with Fish and Wildlife Service and BIA, that supported a lot of the research and monitoring efforts. And the Forest Service has been really supporting and funding a lot of the on the ground work, with some funding coming in from a few other sources. So yeah, they might be best to fill in some of the missing gaps there that I wasn't able to answer.
That sounds great. Tanya, thank you so much. And we'll see you at the end of the symposium. We'll bring you back in for more questions, more Q&A.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Our next presenter is Dr. Brian Palik, and Brian is a science leader for the Applied Forest Ecology with the USDA Forest Service's Northern Research Station in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. Forgive me. Brian earned his PhD in forest ecology from the University of Michigan, along with serving as adjunct faculty with multiple institutions of higher learning. He also works broadly on questions related to the ecological sustainability of managed forests through use of operational scale and long-term silvicultural research. Brian will be offering two presentations today. His first one will focus on an ecological model for fire reintroduction in an old growth red pine woodland. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. So you should be seeing my first slide and hearing me.
We are.
Okay,
Yep.
cool. Okay, so really work towards restoring forest towards that functioning ecological condition that Keith referred to. And both of these deal with red pine dominated woodlands. This first one is dealing with how fire can be reintroduced into a long fire excluded pine system. And it's our role is really from a research entity standpoint, providing some information to help facilitate this collaboration between the Leech Lake Band and the National Forest that you've been hearing about today. So what I'm going to do mostly is set the stage in terms of what red pine woodlands should look like, or did look like, or could look like. And then I'll get into this Sunken Lake project, which is an example of fire restoration. So first, let's set the stage. When I talk about pine woodlands in the Lake States, if you speak land fire, I'm really talking about this Laurentian Acadia northern pine woodland that occurs across the 3 lake states and in Canada as well. And what do we know about it? What we know is red pine occurs in some abundance, oftentimes a lot of abundance, in many different types of native plant communities, habitat types, ecosystems. And what you're seeing there is a list of, it's from the Minnesota Native Plant Community Guide, the systems in northern and central Minnesota that have an abundance of red pine or mixed pine in them. And just note that there's similar ecosystem descriptions for Wisconsin and Michigan as well. It's not unique to just here. Most of our work occurs in this northern dry mesic mixed woodland, and it's the most abundant or widespread in terms of area in northern Minnesota. So what do we know about that ecosystem? Well, in terms of disturbance regimes, we know that fire was important, and mostly fire, but we've also learned that wind, blowdown, and root rots, native root diseases were also important. But anyhow, in terms of fire, here's what people thought for the longest time based on work that Heinzelman did in the north. And it's that the crown fires occurred every maybe on average 200 years fire return interval, and then frequent service fires. And I will say that Heinzelman actually never said this. It's a misinterpretation of something he did say and write and work on, but it really has stuck through the ages in terms of what people thought about. And you can see that in this description of the fire regime for this northern dry mesic mixed woodland, these infrequent catastrophic fires, frequent low intensity surface fires. So people operated under that kind of understanding for a long time. Well, there's been really great quantitative work in a number of places, but including on the Chippewa National Forest, really trying to get at what the fire regimes truly were like in these mixed pine systems. And this comes out of work that Mike Stambaugh at the University of Missouri did with us, and he's working elsewhere on this same question. And you can see it's the locations that he's worked on the chip, fire return intervals ranging from 1 to 40 years with a mean of 6.6 years, so really frequent. And there, again, similar estimates for fire and how it worked in Wisconsin and Michigan. So what that really tells us, you can't have a stand replacing fire every 6.6 years. So these were mixed severity fire regimes, including less than stand replacing fire, low intensity surface fires, occasionally intensifying to something that was disturbing the overstory. And interestingly enough, these people I list at the bottom knew this. So if you go back to the old literature, people wrote about this. They knew how these forests work, but then something happened where people seized onto Heinzelman's interpretation, and we lost track of what these things really looked like or worked like. And so here's a little bit more about how this ecosystem looked and worked. So this is reconstruction of establishment history for 7 old growth red pine dominated stands in Minnesota. And this is work Sean Fravor at the University of Maine did when he was with us. And you can see that they were really complex in terms of pine age structure. So the first circled at the top is broadly single cohort, but like a 60-year establishment window for pine. And then the one circled at the bottom is really complex, so multi-cohort age structures. And the point is that pines were regenerating near residual overstory trees after disturbance in these cases. They weren't truly stand replacement disturbances regenerating to even age stands. And these are just great photos from the Chippewa National Forest in the 20s or so that show this really kind of large gap opening based regeneration events, disturbance and regeneration events in pine. So again, not unique to Minnesota. People are learning and have discovered the same thing in Michigan and Wisconsin and in Canada. So what else do we know about these ecosystems? Well, we talk about red pine, but they were really mixed species. And you can see examples of bearing tree percentages from different locations in the lake states. And here in Minnesota, this FDN 33A that I've been focusing on had 11 species of trees in it. And that photo shows all 3 pines in that are native pines there. So again, why? Mixed severity fire regimes, including less than stand replacing fire that created a range of conditions for different trees. What else do we know? Well, we know they were woodlands. Been saying that, these descriptions here, most of them have woodland in the title. So variable, open canopy, not closed forest, high density forest like they're managed for timber. And again, why? Frequent mixed severity fire that created those variable open conditions. Okay, so now with that kind of background of understanding of what a mature old growth mixed pine woodland should look like, well, think about this project here. So the Sunken Lake project is a collaborative effort to restore that ecosystem characteristic through fire reintroduction. And it involves all these entities here that you've been hearing about. You haven't heard as much about the Leech Lake Tribal College, but they're involved with this. And I know there are people from the college on today. So we'll get into this project, but first, where is Sunken Lake? So Sunken Lake occurs on the Cutfoot Experimental Forest, and you can see the general location there. So right within the boundaries of both these entities, the Chippewa National Forest and the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe Reservation, and of course, the broader interpretation of that is this whole thing is within the traditional homeland of the Leech Lake Band. So what I've come to learn over the years of working there, that Cutfoot Experimental Forest and Sunken Lake is really important to the band and band members. So a little bit more on Cutfoot Experimental Forest. It was established a long time ago, 1932. It's about 3,100 acres. It's mostly this fire-dependent dry mesic woodland with red pine dominance. And research began even in that area, began before it was even established. And really until I came along, I guess, for better or worse, it focused on timber management, research geared at timber management for red pine. And we've really kind of flipped the coin there, and we're focused much more on ecological management approaches, restoration, and climate adaptation. So then within Cutfoot, there's the Sunken Lake Natural Area. You can see that square there. And it's called Sunken Lake because of that lake there that dropped in lake elevation very rapidly. If you look in this photo in the background, that notch is an esker that blew out a number of years ago, and the lake level dropped like 15 feet within a matter of hours, hence the name Sunken Lake. So the natural area itself is a section, 640 acres. It's mostly old pine or pine hardwood mixtures, and largely there's been no management in it. Again, it's this fire-dependent dry mesic woodland that I've been talking about. Fire origin, red pine dominated. We know that the pine areas are multi-cohort and structural. Look at this and that in a minute. It's been fire excluded. Keith referred to this since the early 1900s, and it's highly overstocked. If you're familiar with these numbers and what they mean, 180 to 200 square feet per acre is way more than stocking of trees than a pine woodland should have. And it has this dense shrub layer, mostly beak hazel. So the interpretation there that, and I really like the way Keith said this, it's not ecologically functioning the way it should or could. So what you're seeing here is in the middle is an actual sample that Mike Stambaugh used for dating from this research. And you can see the fire scars that he's tabulated on there. And then the top graph on the right is the pine cohort establishment dates. And those dates are two known fires. And presumably that earlier cohort had a fire as well. It just, there's no record of it. And then that's actually a stem map plot from within Sunken Lake. It's, you know, it's not the whole Sunken Lake area, but it's a plot in it that Sean Fravor stem mapped, and you can see the intermix of pine cohorts in there. Not one age, and not not a even age single cohort kind of forest at all. Here's another way to look at it that last graphic didn't show, and it's the hardwood encroachment that's going on with lack of fire and the lack of pine regeneration. So again, this just shows the red and white pine establishment dates, and then off to the right in that tail are the non-pines, which are things like paper birch and a lot of red maple, as you can imagine. And then the bottom is the diameter distribution. So the smaller, and that doesn't show the trees under 12.5 centimeters diameter. So there's certainly a lot more of them as well. And then no pine regeneration since sometime in the early last century. Okay, so what I've tried to do is give you a sense of what this ecosystem could look like, should look like under a natural fire regime, and then what it looks like now. And that's the Sunken Lake area is just one example. It's not the only one that looks that way, with hardwood encroachment, lack of pine, overstocked. So the Sunken Lake Fire Reintroduction project is meant to try to think about getting that example ecosystem back towards that ecological functioning condition. So restoring fire to emulate the disturbance regime, reduce hardwood component, increase regeneration opportunities for pine, and promote fire-dependent plant communities. And we'll get back to that last one in a minute here. The prescribed fire objectives for the Chippewa National Forest Fire Program is to reduce fuels with planned multiple burns in burn units as they break them out here. And so if you look on this map, it's broken up into units 1, 2, 3, and 4. Units 1 and 2 are in Sunken Lake, and they, as we'll look at here in a minute, they have been burned. Units 3 and 4 are on the experimental forest, but outside of Sunken Lake. So they're younger, they're managed, and the plan is to burn those as well. And then we consider that area to the right in Sunken Lake to be a control that isn't currently planned to be burned, but we'll just follow it relative to the burning. So let's look at this idea of the goal of promoting fire-dependent plant communities. That's really where the Leech Lake Band and the Tribal College come in. And it's via this project that was an intern project that was funded initially by the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. And it's looking at the effects of fire reintroduction in pine woodlands for important species, particularly blueberry species. And you can see the people involved in this, and I believe all of the names, all those folks are on the call here. And perhaps some of the interns from the college that had worked on this are as well. So the goal really is focusing on blueberries initially. And here's what has happened already. So there is a monitoring network in Sunken Lake and really the whole Cutfoot Experimental Forest. And there was pre-burning vegetation monitoring on that network. And if you look on that map, if you can zoom in there and see it, those little white circles are long established monumented monitoring plots that were put in starting in 1931 to 1934. And Doug Castendick, who works with my group, and he's on this call, has worked diligently to relocate as many of these as we can throughout Cutfoot and to remeasure them. And we publish some on, changes from that monitoring network. But anyhow, that's where this information comes from. And it just shows blueberries pooled, the two species, both density and then cover. And the way this is set up, this is again pre-burning numbers you're looking at here. So where it says burn, that was the units that have been burned, but sampling before the burn, then the control, then the manage. And it looks like the managed system actually has a bit more in terms of blueberry density and cover. We haven't got to, or the group that's doing this haven't got to fruit production yet, which is the real telling thing in terms of flowering and fruiting. But anyhow, gives you an idea what that looks like and where it's going. So just a little bit on the status of the fire reintroduction. So there was a burn last spring in 2021, and it was that unit 1 and 2 that were burned. And there was the second burn planned for this spring. But if you're aware of what's going on nationally with the Forest Service, there is a temporary ban, postponement of prescribed fires throughout the country because of what happened in New Mexico. So that burn is on hold. There's a possibility it can still happen this fall, which is actually more in line with probably when fires occur in this system. There is post first fire vegetation monitoring that just started, I believe, this week with the Leech Lake Band and the Tribal College folks in particular. So just some photos that Doug took from that burn. So that's what we know today. The other thing we do know, without even having another burn or measuring this yet, is that one burn is not enough relative to hazel and what happens to it with prescribed fire. So again, Hazel encroachment is a huge problem in our pine systems that interfere with a lot of things, pine regeneration, diversity of other plant species. So there's an example. This top left is the Sunken Lake area, the burned and unburned side after one burn, you can see that. And then there's beaked hazel resprouting after a single fire. So you top kill it, but it comes back with a vengeance. And we know that that's a problem. And it comes out of another project we have on Cutfoot, which is a long-term prescribed fire study that was started in 1960 by this gentleman that's standing by that sign, who was able to visit before he passed away a few years ago. And it's season of burn and frequency of burn. You can see dormant, summer, annual, biennial, periodic, and then unburned control. And here's what happens with Cutfoot. This is after 4 burns. And the way this is arrayed is the control, no fire, dormant season fire, annually, every other year, periodic, growing season fire. And after 4 burns, they knock back hazel. And I guess standard errors hadn't been invented yet, 64. I don't know, because they're not on there. But you can see what happens. Dormant season burning just makes hazel mad. It comes back with a vengeance, and doesn't matter if it's annual burns or not. And there's 74 remeasurement. So same thing, dormant season, not good. Actually makes it worse than the control. 11 burns. They actually did 11 burns on this study, and got rid of all the hazel. There was none left. And then we remeasured this 36 years after the last fire. In 2005 with students that did this. And you can see that no fires since whatever it was, 1971, and there's still a pretty low density of hazel in that summer annual burning relative to the control. Okay, so I'm going to finish up here just summarizing. Natural mixed fire woodlands are rare on mixed pine woodlands are rare in the landscape, really anywhere, including in northern Minnesota. And a lack of fire over the last 100 years and timber focused management. We'll talk about that in my second talk, what that looks like, really contribute to that loss. Where appropriate, fire reintroduction may help to restore woodland structure and composition. And I'm not getting into this, but we certainly can talk about it. That kind of restoration actually increases adaptation potential to climate change in this ecosystem. And there's really limited experience monitoring results of burning in old pine. They do some of this in Michigan for sure and other places, but here not so much. And the Sunken Lake project provides that opportunity. And then restoration of pine woodlands is culturally important, as Keith pointed to people of the Leech Lake Band. And so this partnership that we just try to facilitate really among the band, the tribal college, the national forest, is key to moving this particular project forward. And I'll just finish up by saying I'm talking here, but these people here are the ones that are doing the work on this particular project. And Doug Kastdick in particular, who works with us in our lab, has really spearheaded this effort of trying to get fire back into Sunken Lake, and he's on the call as well. So I believe, Lisa, I am done with that.
Thank you, Brian, very much. That was very interesting. And we do have a question for you and some time. This is from Shelley Hedke. We are working on reintroducing fire to a jack pine woodland NPC. And if you look at chat, there's a number there that's related, FDC 23A. Don't know if that means anything to you, on a scientific and natural area in Hubbard County, Minnesota. As mentioned, there is reticence to include fire in coniferous forests, rightly so, given potential volatility of these fuels. We're thinking about timing of fire to reduce some of the risks, but still meet site objectives. Any thoughts about sponsoring or collaborating on training days for fire practitioners in FD forest fuel types?
Well, so first of all, what I would say is those of you who aren't aware of this, the state of Minnesota has a really great ecological classification guide, and they call them native plant communities. So that's what that NPC is. And then there's, the designations of whatever it happens to be. And they're similar to habitat types from that people in Wisconsin use. So that's what we're talking about there. And I guess I would just say that absolutely interested in helping inform. I am not a fire person. and I don't really research fire, prescribe fire. What I research is what these systems look like under their natural disturbance regime. So to the extent that that can be helpful, I certainly am interested, if that's the question.
Would you say that native plant communities are equivalent to Texas ecoregions?
I'm guessing that that's different scale. So when I hear ecoregion, I'm thinking something larger scale, like the Superior Uplands in northeastern Minnesota. Whereas native plant communities are really focused at when you go out to a particular site and stand, you key it to a native plant community. So more like ecological land type phases, if you know that terminology that some people use. So smaller scale, I'm guessing.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right, one more. We're still in good shape time-wise. All right, this is from Carly Lapin. Are you aware of any sites where mechanical treatments are being used to control or reduce hazel instead of fire? Any ideas on what works?
Yes, well, absolutely, I'm aware of it. So the Chippewa National Forest, there's people on here that could speak to this, use something called a harrowing device, which is kind of like, plow discs or whatever they're called, harrowing discs on a skidder. And they break up the hazel roots, and it creates a mineral soil furrow that you can either plant on or natural regeneration seeding occurs on. And it does reduce hazel for a number of years and provides more opportunity for regeneration. So I'm aware of that. They've done it for us on multiple projects, and I'm sure there's other groups that use other mechanical means. I guess I would also say we have a long-term project in pine where we manually removed, knocked back hazel with brush saws over pretty large areas, like 40-acre blocks, and over a number of years. And you can reduce hazel density over time by doing that. Probably 1 or 2 times isn't going to help, but multiple times knocks it back.
Okay, very good. I'm going to save Rick Horton's question for the end. That's a good one.
Yeah, Rick's question wouldn't be easy to answer. I can anticipate.
Folks may want to look into that one. That's a big one.
Yep. Okay,
great. Brian, thank you so much. And we'll see you in a little bit. Okay, our next presenter, Stephen Handler, is a climate change specialist with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station and Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. His role with NIACS is to coordinate climate adaptation efforts across the upper Midwest, which involves building partnerships, assessing climate change risk, and working with land managers and landowners to develop real-world projects to prepare for change. Stephen was co-author for the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu among many wonderful partners. We look forward to learning more about this menu. The full session title is Dibaginjigaadeg, Anishinaabe, Ezhitwaad, a Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu. I hope I got close. Stephen, thank you so much.
Thanks, Lisa. And you did great. Yeah, much better than I did my first time. So, Miigwech, thank you, everybody. Thanks to the organizers for bringing me into this presentation. I'm speaking on behalf of a large group here, who I will recognize later in the presentation. And I just want to say from the outset that I think Tanya, Brian, Keith, Jen, everyone who's spoken today has already demonstrated many great examples of what it takes to implement and embody this co-stewardship model of listening and demonstrating a commitment to working together, understanding tribal priorities and expressing them through research and management. So maybe my talk is kind of a punctuation mark on what you've already heard a lot of today. And so I'll applaud all the other speakers who have gone before me. So I work for a group called NIACS that Lisa mentioned. That's the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. I'm a Forest Service employee, and I'm part of this NIACS group that is a little bit of a hybrid oddball in the agency. And I tell folks we're kind of like a climate change help desk or a climate change phone a friend shop. for land managers of all shapes and sizes. So we work with federal agencies, state agencies, tribes, land management consultants, counties, conservation groups, land trusts, you name it. Basically anyone who's ready to have a discussion about climate change risks and how to adapt. And so this has been our bread and butter at NIAX for over a decade. I'm going to talk to you today about an effort that that came from one of our quote unquote standard climate adaptation workshops and meetings, after which we were approached by a handful of participants at that meeting representing tribes and tribal organizations in the Lake States. And essentially their message was, this is great. We like your approach, and we like that you're addressing climate change adaptation, but it's not exactly how we would do it. We would probably have started on a different foot and ended up expressing things a little differently. And that sincere comment to us, constructive feedback in 2017 kind of spawned this whole effort. And so another point in favor of, speaking honestly, listening to each other, working together, and it can lead you in all sorts of interesting places, which is what I'll describe here. So let's start off with maybe some basics that don't maybe need to be elaborated on a whole lot, but I think we can all agree that climate change is resulting in different and distinct challenges for tribal communities. Tribal communities have long-standing relationships with non-human relatives throughout the natural world, and they rely on these relationships for ceremonial, medicinal, spiritual, economic needs, the whole gambit. We can also say clearly that the Western view of land management, kind of this control and react manager view of how we relate to the natural world, that has also influenced conventional attitudes towards climate change adaptation, in that we see ourselves as managers, and we enact a change on the natural world and we expect a response. And we're going to do that with some forethought to help these systems cope with climate change, because we are their stewards. And that's kind of the conventional attitude that a lot of agencies and land managers have towards climate adaptation. And so this creates a situation where it's not always compatible. The common discourse on climate change adaptation with indigenous perspectives on working with the land and our relatives. Therefore, because of this discussion that I mentioned after a workshop we had in 2017, we started on this pathway to create this tool, which we call the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu. It was born out of this need to create an adaptation planning tool that better integrates indigenous knowledge, culture, science, and perspectives with Western science and perspectives on climate adaptation. And also to help facilitate a more constructive dialogue between tribes and non-tribal partners, to be kind of a communication bridge between those sometimes different viewpoints. So I'm going to be giving you kind of a tour and some examples of how we have used this Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu over the years since it was published in 2019. I mentioned I was going to acknowledge our big team. So we had a long list of partners that really brought a lot of enthusiasm and energy and different perspectives to this project, including multi-tribal commissions, including individual tribes, including tribal colleges, tribal citizens, and the Forest Service and NIAX. The first thing that this tribal climate adaptation menu provides is a nice section on guiding principles that can be helpful for those of us who don't have a background working with tribal communities, aren't used to seeing things in this viewpoint, and can be kind of a primer on what these relationships might look like and how to cultivate these healthy relationships. And so this I'm glad we built it in here because I think it's a necessary first step. Like I mentioned, Tanya, Brian, Keith, and Jen have already demonstrated a lot of these guiding principles through their work. This tribal climate adaptation menu was written specifically from an Ojibwe and Menominee perspective, because our partners that built this tool are from the upper Midwest and Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But we've intentionally created it as kind of an open source tool that tribal communities from other parts of the country can take and adapt to their own language and customs and perspectives. And we already have groups in Maine and the Southwest, excuse me, and Oklahoma who are interested in tailoring this document for their own purposes. Just one example of one of these guiding principles, and that I think kind of fuels a lot of the rest of what comes out of this is that other beings, other entities, they are not resources to be managed, they're relatives. And you get this when you talk to tribal communities and tribal citizens and folks who work for tribal natural resources departments. And it's something fundamental, but it shifts that whole stance of how we relate. And that follows on with climate adaptation decision making as well. That it should be a reciprocal relationship based on respect. So we use this tribal adaptation menu. It was designed to be used as part of an adaptation planning framework. And so I'm showing you here a 5-step process that NIAX has been using since 2012. We call it the Adaptation Workbook that we've been using to help land managers articulate their goals, consider climate change risks, identify appropriate adaptation actions, figure out how to monitor the effectiveness of those actions through time. This is a workshop process that we've demonstrated. We have a library of over 500 real-world adaptation case studies across the US. And so this was kind of the structure that the tribal adaptation menu was meant to fit into. But I'd say that the tribal adaptation menu could inform any sorts of planning processes. It doesn't need to be this climate adaptation process. But I'll come back to this when I share a couple examples of how we've used the tribal adaptation menu. And we use these menus to kind of support this brainstorming step in the process, where we ask people to be creative and to consider what actions could you take to cope with climate change challenges, to take advantage of potential opportunities, and to move towards whatever your desired future condition is that you want to see on the landscape and among the beings on that landscape. Okay, so what is a climate adaptation menu? An adaptation menu, and NIAX has a suite of these dealing with kind of more conventional forestry and silviculture, watershed management, outdoor recreation, wildlife management. Tribal adaptation menu is another addition to this library of menus. And for each discipline, an adaptation menu is meant to be a collection of climate adaptation actions that could be implemented in a specific place. They're organized hierarchically to take folks from general to more specific ideas. We call 2 levels in our menu hierarchy strategies and approaches. So strategies are general, and for example, our forestry menu has 10 general strategies and about 40 more specific approaches nested under those general strategies. The tribal adaptation menu has 14 general strategies and 60 or 70 more specific approaches. And like the way we use them is it's kind of a choose your own adventure catalog for land managers to be able to pick and choose adaptation actions that feel most suitable for their particular project or context that they happen to be working in. And they help you express or articulate, here's how this specific management action relates to climate adaptation. Or if you're just searching around, you can find general climate adaptation ideas that seem appropriate and then burrow down to get more specific ideas on, okay, how would this sounds interesting, but how would I implement it more specifically in my place? That's where the more specific approaches can lead you to more concrete ideas. So a brainstorming prompt that is written in terms that experts in that discipline will understand. And so I'm showing you here on the screen just an example strategy and approach from our forestry and silviculture adaptation menu. And then kind of an equivalent strategy and approach the way it was rewritten and revisioned with our partners as we wrote the tribal adaptation menu. And I'm showing you this one because this idea of invasive species really kicked off a lot of interesting and sensitive discussions with tribal partners about what is invasive, what is non-native, who gets to decide who belongs, what beings get to belong in a community, what right and what obligation do we have to listen to those beings and to respect them as they're just carrying out their life history and their original instructions. And so you can see how kind of sitting with and wrestling with this idea of invasive species got expressed differently through this lens of tribal and indigenous perspectives. And it's more about community balance. There's an idea of attempting to communicate with beings and explaining your actions before coming in and acting as a manager or controller of a system. I'm also showing the first page of the menu of strategies and approaches just to highlight the first 3 strategies in our climate adaptation menu are consulting with cultural leaders, community members, and elders, considering practices of reciprocity, and understanding the human and landscape history of the community. That gives you a sense of some of these more specific ideas that come under that big strategy of considering cultural practices and spiritual guidance. In some cases before deciding what to do and how to act. So a little peek in the cover here, where if you can insert the link to the tribal adaptation menu for folks who are interested in scanning through, you can scroll to page 18 in the tribal adaptation menu PDF and get a concise list of these strategies and approaches. How have we been using the tribal adaptation menu? I'll focus on a couple different examples. So we've been holding in-person workshops, obviously postponed during the pandemic, but we just had our first post-pandemic workshop a couple of weeks ago. In each of these workshops, we have invited tribal members, tribal natural resources staff, and other agency staff to come together to bring real-world project ideas, natural resource management projects, and to run them through that adaptation workbook process that I showed earlier, and to use the tribal adaptation menu to express and brainstorm culturally appropriate adaptation actions to help their project ideas cope with changing conditions. The most recent workshop that I mentioned, the unifying theme of that workshop was all related to wild rice or manoomin, restoration enhancement gathering across the Lake States. Some places we have a theme like that. Some instances we have a theme like that for our workshop. Other times it's just anyone in a region who can come together in a specific place. And so now there's a collection of 41 projects around the country that have been launched by these workshop-based tribal adaptation menu projects. And I'll show you an example of one of those. We had folks from the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, which is in northern Wisconsin, for those of you who aren't familiar with the area, and they were seeking some help to integrate Ojibwe traditional ecological knowledge with a published climate change vulnerability assessment for their national lakeshore, and to express also kind of the cultural history of the place in their broader climate change education and outreach campaign. And so this was a long and winding road after attending one of our workshops, but they ultimately produced this website that I think is really fantastic, and I'd encourage you all to check it out as an example of a way, like I mentioned, kind of bridging that gap in communication between traditional ecological knowledge and kind of the Western mindset of research and management. The other thing I wanted to mention is that since its creation, since its publication in 2019, we've been using the tribal adaptation menus with national forests in part of their NEPA planning process for vegetation management projects. And so when this is part of my role as a Forest Service employee, one of my jobs is to, when requested, to sit with an interdisciplinary team on a national forest as they are going through their project planning process that's required in the NEPA Act. And I typically lead them through a structured discussion to go through the adaptation workbook and to consider how climate change impacts affect their ability to meet their stated outcomes, and to help them build in new and different climate adaptation ideas, or to articulate how their business as usual management relates to and supports climate adaptation. Like I mentioned, NIAX has a library of adaptation menus. So the silviculturist works with the forestry menu. The aquatic staff work with our watershed management menu. The fuels and fire folks work with our fire adapted ecosystems menu. And that had been working well. That's a good way for folks to brainstorm and share ideas as part of this ID team process. But now we can also put this tribal adaptation menu resource in front of each of them and ask them to consider, well, does this prompt any new ideas for your resource area? Are there things you could suggest or bring to tribal nations that you consult with through part of the consultation process, or even through informal collaboration with tribal natural resources staff? The Chippewa is a great example, Chippewa National Forest, because like Jen and Keith mentioned, Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe staff are actually part of those ID team meetings. So now we're having these discussions in real time on two recent projects that Chippewa and LLBO have gone through. And just I'm showing a couple examples of ideas that have been prompted by folks brainstorming off of this tribal adaptation menu. Some of these are ways to express some of what the Chippewa National Forest had already intended. And some of these were new ideas that were prompted by staff from both agencies looking at this menu together and talking about it. So that is where I'll stop for now. And I've left plenty of time for questions. I'm happy to go back or go anywhere y'all want to take me.
Thank you, Stephen, very much. That was a great presentation on a really very interesting project. One question I have is, Are we seeing this play out in other regions of the Forest Service? Under the, you know, the climate program, similar climate programs to what you're involved with, or is this unique?
Well, so big picture, the Forest Service, I would say each region of the Forest Service is kind of figuring out their own best practices for how to adapt to climate change, and so there are centers like NIACS in other parts of the country.
Okay.
And so some national forests are doing things slightly differently. We are, like I said, we are working with partners in other parts of the country to share what we've done and to think about, well, could this Ojibwe and Menominee based tribal adaptation menu be useful to you in your context? And so we're interested to see how that might play out, especially for example, I mentioned we're putting an idea together with a tribe in Oklahoma, that's the Chickasaw Nation. One of the things I'm fascinated to see is, number one, how they might tailor this and make it their own with their own culture and values, but also how might a tribe with a history of removal and displacement use this sort of a tool to relate to national forests or other public lands that are in their ancestral homelands. And so that's, I think that's going to be fascinating to see.
Wonderful. Well, it does feel like we are going to be seeing a lot more of this good work play out over time. Thank you for all you're doing to advance it. And with that, we are, before we go, so last minute question flying in from Susan Petrie. Are there examples of this menu system being explored with smaller tribes with less capacity and staff that you might know of?
Yeah, great question. And so you're asking this question because I'm that clues me in that you already know that a lot of tribal natural resource departments are woefully understaffed, and folks are heroically wearing multiple hats for a lot of tribal natural resources departments, and so we often encounter that. For example, when we organize these tribal adaptation menu workshops, we request folks to bring real world projects that they may be working on. And so in a workshop, say of 30 people, we may get 8 people who come forward and say, yes, this is a project idea that I'd like to consider. And I'd like to figure out how to incorporate climate adaptation into what I want to accomplish. And so in many cases, that's a tribal natural resource staff coming on their own. And then the nice thing about these workshops is that the other 20 people who sign up, they're just interested in the process, and they're interested to be kind of sounding boards and shadow project shotguns, and so they can oftentimes provide additional expertise in a different discipline. We try to arrange these project teams in a way that best supports that proponent who might be working solo, and they might have a background in wildlife management, but a lot of what they want to do involves forestry decisions. Well, maybe we can team them up with some foresters from other organizations in the region who can support them and help them make decisions and connect them to resources.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Stephen, and I'd like to thank Tanya and Brian as well for the presentations that have all been, it should give everybody a really great sense about the collaborative co-management work that's being done on the Chippewa National Forest and the Leech Lake Band of the Ojibwe Reservation. Our last project presentation for the day is entitled A Natural Model for Red Pine Plantation Silviculture, and this is given to you by Keith Karnes and Brian Palik, 2 people that you have already heard talk and you know a little bit about. So take it away, Keith and Brian.
Keith and I are going to tag team this, and that looks like my slide that we're starting with. So we're just going to be talking about the Sandplain Pines project, and Keith's going to give you a background that really ties into his introductory talk really well. And then I'll follow up with what we're trying to do in that project in terms of restoration. And Keith, it looks like that slide is mine as well, the second one. So just in general, it's restoring ecological conditions representative native plant communities in red pine plantations as part of this Sandplain Pines project. So Keith?
Yeah. This is the pine and spruce thinning project was one that we started. It was our first TFPA project. Go to the next slide, please, Brian. And how I mentioned it in my earlier talk today, but how did it come to exist? When we first started looking at the Tribal Forest Protection Act, I wanted to figure out how I was going to go about doing this. And I went up and I talked to my boss, who's a Leech Lake tribal member. He's lived up here his whole life. And I asked him, what do you want me to bring to the Forest Service? How do you want me to go about this? And he thought about it, and he was looking for the words he wanted to use. And ultimately he came up, he said he wants his woods back. So now that letter stemming from 2016 up till now, I've taken that idea of my boss wants his woods back. And how am I going to make that fit into this giant landscape with all these different types of cover types, forests, native plant communities, and everything. But we took our first swing at it as I was driving one day and went past an incredibly dense pine plantation and realized this is as good a place to start as any. Next slide, please. And again, it came, the Tribal Forest Protection Act was 2004 federal legislation. We've invoked it 5 times. Probably going to use it more. It's gaining popularity across the country. Next slide, please. And it says the tribe must propose a specific project. I actually had the opportunity to have a discussion with a guy from Eastern Band of Cherokee yesterday in North Carolina, and he was wondering about that very thing. How specific does it need to be? And I told him, well, try proposing a project that is a little more broad, because we're entering into this paradigm shift of forest management with the idea that there's multiple attributes to the forest and everything is intertwined. So if you bring a broad project with a number of these interminglings combined, I think it would be reflective of a more holistic tribal forest management regime. Next slide, please. And it behooves us to do this. I know this was on one of the slides that Jen shared this morning. This overlap that we have with the Chippewa National Forest, we share over 3,000 miles of common boundary, if you include lakes and everything. The Chippewa National Forest, as far as land held inside the reservation, is the largest landholder, followed by the Minnesota DNR, and the tribe comes in third as far as land holdings go. So it behooves us to work with our partners, with the National Forest and with the Minnesota DNR. Next slide, please. And again, this is the area that was circled. There's approximately 4,500 acres encompassed in young red pine plantation. There's a couple of spruce ones, but mostly it's young red pine plantation. And the ages are on the lower end of the 20 to 40. There's a lot of them that are under 30 years old, which not too many people from industry are going to be looking to do thinning, I don't think, at that age, but I think if a person were a better mathematician than I am, you could show that you're actually going to get more wood out of there if you hit it early and retain that live crown and can get the growth and do your aggressive thinning. And so that's what we're trying to do. And then we focused on this project to try to not have everybody to be able, so everybody could kind of encompass the idea in their heads, you know, instead of going nearly 16,000 acres across the national forest, we're focusing on this 4,500 in this exact area. It's easier to get your head wrapped around that. Next slide, please. And some of the simple goals again, you know, invoking the desired vegetative conditions, the range of natural variation. You know, forests, I mean, they're going to have some semblance of diversity in there. I mean, you were getting that from Brian's talk earlier, you know, the woodlands aesthetic, you know, so I think there was one, it was 11 or 13 species that were in, you know, included in this native plant community. And, you know, to look at these things and start to restore what that historic forest was there, you know, and that includes fire. Next slide, please. Yeah, I know Brian had shared some older photos of the area, and this is one that I like. This is from the this is actually hanging on the wall over at the Chippewa National Forest Supervisor's office, and you can see these large pine. It's wide open. It's almost like a pine savanna, and you know, it needs to be diverse. It needs to have open space. There should be fruiting shrubs. You know, all these things that existed back when, I guess, you know, bygone era, you know, before the growing space had to be maximized in timber. Next slide, please. And now we've moved that project, that pine spruce one, we've moved it also into fire restoration, realizing that, you know, to truly set the stage, you got to truly set the stage, you know, so you start with the ground up. I know I was hoping you would say, Brian, that after 2 brushings of hazel, you were good to go, because we brushed a lot of these twice only. It's all we could afford. But a lot of these aggressive thinning entries that we're going to do in there, we're going to be hitting those hazel acres with that as well. You know, and we're doing all this with the thinning, and we're putting the meat on the bark, all in preparation to start restoring fire to these areas. You know, because again, they are fire dependent, and it has been over 100 years in many cases, you know, and the fire return intervals that were mentioned earlier in Brian's talk. I mean, indigenous burning, you know, historic and cultural traditional burning is getting more noticed as time goes now, as being a legitimate thing. Next slide, please. And you know, a popular phrase now is you know, in my working day is tribal adaptation. So we have taken now both of these TFPA projects, this pine and the spruce, the pine, the spruce, and the fire restoration one, and we're putting them both together into this 638 agreement that I referred to in my first talk this morning. The 638 agreements, again, they have to have a TFPA project, but as far as I know, this is the only one that is including 2 TFPA projects. And I think it's going to make for a wonderful story, a wonderful ecosystem restoration story. This is the site where we're finding blueberries and we're finding fruiting shrubs are coming back. And it comes with us doing things out of the norm, you know, going in a different direction, regardless of how popular it is. There are certainly factions in the forest world here in Minnesota that don't like what we're doing. But I would say, I mean, the tribes have this sovereign right to have their forests the way they traditionally had them. And that's what I'm going to push for. It's what I push for every day, and I'm going to continue. And I believe I got one more slide, which is just a repetitious slide. But I wrote myself a little note that a lot of this change in paradigm, it comes with a lot of repetition. You know, I mean, we're constantly talking about a paradigm shift, constantly talking about sovereignty and all of these things. And, you know, it slowly but surely starts to infiltrate into people's minds, and it gets more and more embraced as time goes on. So again, this isn't just another forest, it's a homeland for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. And with that, I'll pass it to Brian.
Hey, thanks, Keith. So my role in this talk and in this project has been to inform this project and the cooperation on how this can be done, how plantations of red pine can be restored to be closer to that healthy, ecologically functioning condition that Keith referred to earlier. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. Keith and I have done this before, and I did more of a context on red pine, but we just had this. So this is all review. Remember, red pine in a lot of native plant communities in Minnesota, and there's the things we know about them: woodlands, variable structure, low stocking, a lot of tree species, mixed severity fire, and there was a lot of that type of ecosystem. So it's kind of hard to tally it up, but roughly 1.5 million hectares in Minnesota of something that used to look like that. And then again, I talked about these complex age structures when they're old, not even age stands that regenerated after stand replacing disturbance. Certainly that happened in places, but nowhere that we'd measured. So again, evidence for structurally complex stands. And then, okay, so the point of this is now let's think about what we have now. So in Minnesota now, there's roughly 250,000 hectares of red pine dominated forest. And this number is actually lake states wide. 76% of those are plantations. I don't know what it might be in Minnesota. I assume it's something similar. So a lot of what was natively or naturally red pine woodland is now plantation. And it's managed at this high stocking level, basal area density. Keith was talking about the A line and B line. Those are forestry terms for thinking about stocking, and you want to be above the B and below the A, and you're using all the available growing space and resources. Fire excluded for a number of reasons. And typically this is managed that way using what I call a timber-focused silvicultural model. And why is that? Because it's a really important resource in the state. 300,000 cords of wood, red pine harvested annually, and those kinds of products. So really high economic value. And I don't want to discount that that's important. But if you have the kind of goals that the Leech Lake Band and working with the Chippewa National Forest have been talking about with Keith, you can see that something different may need to be done. So let's just think about what that is, but relative to this. So I'm not going to go into great detail of this, but this timber-focused silvicultural model for pine, this is how conifer plantations are managed pretty much everywhere. So it's just generalized, but it looks something like that. You know, where you're clear cutting it, you're planting it, there may be some thinnings, and then final harvest, which in red pine, people like to do, again, an even age silvicultural system. So you have even age stands, spatially homogeneous, high density, shorter rotations relative to the lifespan of a tree. We're talking about a tree that can live 250, 300 years old, and strongly red pine dominated. And yes, that's the silvicultural model for plantations, but I can tell you, even in natural origin red pine that's managed for timber, it's largely that same kind of model with somewhat different nuances to it. So what I want to do now that gets us back to Sand Plain Pines, and this is what I brought to the Sand Plain Pines project, is what can we do that's more ecosystem focused, leading to restoration of that ecologically functioning characteristic for this ecosystem. And you can read about this if you want in that book, the details of this silvicultural system. But this is a silvicultural approach for red pine that really comes out of like 25 years of studying this type of forest, me studying it and colleagues, and what we've learned and our development of an approach that's much more ecologically focused rather than timber focused. And it's not to say you don't get timber out of this. That's not our intention at all. It's just the way it's done and what it looks like along the way is very different. And what I would point out is this stage here. So we call it young forest, the later young forest in this 30 to 70 year age range, which is overlapping with that age range Keith talked about for Sand Plain Pines. And this is where surface fires would have been occurring in there in that ecosystem, creating some patchy kind of conditions, some openings, thinning pine cohorts, creating seed beds that ultimately leads to another cohort of pine establishing in there. And whether you do that with fire or not, there are silvicultural things that can be done to start creating those conditions. And I list them in red there. And we're going to talk about one in particular here, variable density thinning, which is what I pushed for, what we ultimately need to be doing in Sand Plains Pine Project, so SP cubed. So let's look at that. If you're not familiar with this, variable density thinning is an approach for plantation restoration that developed in the Pacific Northwest, and other people have been thinking about it and adapting it to different settings. And I've been pushing for its use here in the Lake States and in Minnesota and on the Chippewa for a number of years. And we have a couple of projects where we're doing it. And this is what I brought to the table for Sand Plain Pines. So we use a skip, gaps, and thin approach. And you can see kind of a grid representation of that. And then there's an air photo of plantation. So a skip is just part of an area, maybe a 1/4 acre in size that isn't thinned. A gap is just that, a gap opened up in that plantation. And then some level of row thinning in between those two extremes. So the whole idea of this is to accelerate the development of structural complexity in simplified forest plantations. And it shortens the time required to reach a condition where there's mature and older forest structure. So you take a plantation and you kind of jumpstart it towards the development of that complexity. So again, thinning ranges from unthinned to openings and anything in between, or whatever the objectives are. In our case, we actually site prepped in the gaps, and we planted. This is a project on the Chippewa National Forest, and planted species other than pine. And Doug Cassendick, who was on this call, I think he probably still is our technical person on the ground that's really been leading this effort, and he took those pictures as well. So you see an example of that in a younger plantation. There's been one entry into this. There's a second one planned to expand gaps and start breaking up the rows even more. But here's an example of something that's very similar that's been on the ground a while. So this is actually on the Red Lake Wildlife Management Area, which is a state administrated site to the north in northwestern Minnesota. And we have done something very similar here. And these are plantations again. First entry for this was in 2004. So they've been there a while. And you just see some photos of what happens in these plantations. So after the second entry, what we did was thin the matrix and expanded the gaps and lowered the basal area even more to a woodland structure, variable density. The rows are much less obvious now than they were before. And then there's 2 new cohorts of trees now, pines and hardwoods. And in this case here, we actually seeded in the stands over time. So the idea again, and Keith has alluded to this both for the Chippewa Forest and this one, that as these developing, the pines get older, there's potential to bring fire back into them if that's the goal. So what I have talked about is that this is what SP3 can become. In that project, the plantations aren't of this age. I think these were 70, 80 years old when we first started working on this. So they're not quite there yet, but they have the potential to go in that direction. I'll just finish up by summarizing a little bit here. So for both Keith and I, the Sand Plains Prime project is unique in its motivation and goals for the Chippewa National Forest, as Keith has been talking about. It clearly comes out of a requirement for the project through legislation, treaty rights, agency directives. On the ground, what the project is it focused on silviculture to restore complexity and heterogeneity in simplified forests. The desired future conditions are for mixed species woodlands that I've been talking about to provide a wide range of ecosystem services and culturally important values for Leech Lake band members. And then variable density thinning with regeneration. This is where we blur the lines. People don't normally think about regeneration as part of a thinning entry, but this approach does. So we have both, and eventually variable retention harvesting, where we would be removing more of that mature forest and opening it up, and then perhaps prescribed fire that can emulate natural dynamics. And the advantage of doing this include greater habitat diversity, greater tree species diversity, reduced risk, greater options, and climate change adaptation potential is enhanced as well by doing some of the things we're doing. So with that, Lisa, I believe I am done.
Great, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Keith. That was a really great talk to wrap with, because I think it really demonstrated this, goal that was set by a partner, a request that was set by a partner, and then how through science and practice we start to get to those conditions that are desired. Keith, I have a question for you. Well, I'll ask it real quick, and then we've got one from Carly. You, in this next to last slide that you had, you said something, you mentioned prescribed fire and adding to climate impacts. Forgive me, I can't remember exactly the context for the slide, but you mentioned that, you allude to a question that got brought up earlier in the day. And it is, and we're starting to explore that at NAA more with our practitioners, which is, we're doing prescribed fire, something a lot of, thank you very much. There it is, fire restoration. The question, doesn't putting fire in the landscape release carbon into the atmosphere? And you have there, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I don't know if do you have anything to offer there? Anything to offer more in terms of what you as managers on the Chippewa National Forest and on the reservation are thinking about in light of prescribed fire and climate impacts?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It was mentioned in my bio this morning, my first talk, other talks. Some of what Brian was talking about is folded into what I'm talking about. Tanya, Stephen, everybody. And I mean, this change that is coming because of climate change. I mean, it's already happening. It's continuing to happen. And, there's expected to be these major storm events, these derechos, and there could be these catastrophic fires that could come through due to a drought. I mean, heavy rain events followed by long spans of dryness. That's what I've gotten from Stephen over the years. And now if this happens and we get a long stretch of dry, and then we get a fire starts up, and then we get a derecho that comes in there, I mean, we're looking at a catastrophic fire. In climate change, we're trying to retain and hold on to carbon, trying to restore some of the tribal traditional forests to the extent we can. You're never going to get it pre-settlement. But to put fire on the landscape on our time and make it less susceptible to this catastrophic fire, the on the ground fire, the quick return intervals and everything, that is the ounce of prevention. The pound, the catastrophic fire that you're trying to avoid, and at the end of the day, which one's worse? I mean, if you don't have a catastrophic fire, then the argument can be made that every little fire you're doing is putting carbon out there. But I mean, we can argue that every little fire we're doing is putting a little bit of carbon out there versus this catastrophic fire where that would put a lot. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're getting at with that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think this is an interesting question that we're, I think folks want to explore a little further. So thank you for, putting it out there and creating context for it as well. Okay, a couple more questions for you, for the both of you. Carly Lapin asks, can you please elaborate on increasing climate change adaptation potential?
Yes, I was hoping somebody would ask that. So for these, we've studied this, and we have large adaptation projects on the ground, but we've been studying this for a while, and in these red pine woodlands, and it's not unique to them, but we have studied that their lower density, lower basal area, lower stocking leads to enhanced resistance to growth reductions during drought. So we have documented this really well, and we have in ponderosa pine as well out west, and other people have as well. So the trees just have greater resources to soil moisture during and after drought, and when they're managed at a lower stocking level, if that means something to people, lower basal area. So for example, a stand that's maintained at 80 square feet per acre of red pine does much better in terms of growth during drought than a stand managed at 180 square feet. It's a big difference. So by restoring woodland structure, meaning lower density, lower stocking, you increase drought resistance. The other aspect of this, or another aspect of it, is mixed species forests or ecosystems are inherently have greater options with climate change, because something in that mix is going to be favored or do okay or not do as badly with some of the changes that people project for different regions. The other thing is multi-structured vertically forests tend to be more resistant to wind disturbance than forests that don't have that kind of vertical complexity. And that's been studied, in different systems. So there's a number of things that lead to that enhancement.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, Gina Abramson. By increasing the hardwood component in the plantation, will there be a risk of losing the pine component eventually?
Well, I don't know who that's directed to, if one or the other of us said this. There were a mixture of species in that ecosystem, including northern red oak, bur oak, paper birch, trembling aspen. And so they should be there. If we're interested in restoring the ecosystem, not just managing for red pine, then they should be there. And so, yeah, there's probably going to be some compromise in the growing space will be taken up by other species, but you need to keep the desired future condition and the bigger goal in mind. Again, I'm not, there's probably people on this call saying, Brian Palik says we shouldn't be managing for red pine anymore. I'm not saying that, okay? I wish I had a lot of red pine plantation. It's great for managing red pine for timber, but if you're interested in what the Leech Lake Band is interested in, then you would expect some of that hardwood to be coming in.
Keith, anything to offer there? Or
yeah, I mean, we we've had some of my counterparts here at work. I mean, they said, well, we want to have big red pine, we want to have them forever, but we don't want to do any final harvest, we don't want to have any major disturbance. And I think, I mean, you got to have the disturbance there to have that balance, and if you want future large red pine, you got to start with current small red pine as well. I mean, it isn't a magic wand. And the hardwoods, I think having the disturbance in there is going to help balance the level of hardwoods. I think there's some of them that, if given the time and given the density, that they could potentially take over a stand in time. I think those red pine, if they don't have that opening, then they might go the way of the dodo. So.
okay. Well, thank you both again for an excellent presentation and discussion. And at this time, I'd like to invite all of our speakers back. Today, that would include, so if you could all go ahead and turn your video cameras back on and join us as a panel for closing thoughts and discussion. That would be great. Throughout today's program, we have been keeping track of your questions, and some have been held particularly for this discussion when any of our presenters might be able to respond. That said, we encourage you to continue to add questions in chat, and we will do our best to get to them. So please, before we get into some of these questions, I just want to ask our presenters if there's anything else related to your specific projects, the MOU, the collaborative work that you're doing together that you wanted to just offer up that maybe you didn't in your presentations or have just come to mind since you had the stage. Anything?
Lisa, I'll jump in
Please.
first. So I thought about saying this, but I'm glad you're asking this. I have to say that my ability to be kind of a broker of information between the National Forest and the Leech Lake Band is a highlight of my career. I've been doing this up here for 25 years. And I'm not saying it's not without challenges, but it's extremely rewarding. If for no other reason than Keith Karnes and the Leech Lake DRM folks, they get what I'm doing and understand what we're trying to do, which isn't always popular with the timber focused forestry crowd that we deal with. But anyhow, so I really appreciate the opportunity to be doing that.
Thank you, Brian. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll jump in too. You know, as we started moving forward with the Chippewa National Forest on all this, and I mentioned earlier that they are the largest landholder of lands inside the reservation, followed by the DNR, and then thirdly is the tribe. And I've talked to Steve Mortensen, our other wildlife biologist, who's been here for almost 40 years, right, Tanya? And in that entire time, he said he's heard ad nauseum about people desiring to work on a landscape scale, you know, and to truly see landscape scale work is, you don't see it. It's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And I've been trying to plant the seed into these other agencies. I think the CHIP is getting it. The DNR struggling a little bit. But the idea that, I mean, we're poised in a wonderful position to have the lands inside the Leech Lake Reservation truly be a landscape. You know, something that, you know, we can work together and go across property lines and start realizing this true diverse style, all these different native plant communities and forests and ages and species and everything. And I've had folks from the CHIP, one in particular, he said, well, that sounds a lot harder than what I'm doing now. And I told him, well, yeah, I mean, nobody said it was going to be easy, you know, but the reward, you know, with more risk comes the potential for more reward, you know. So I mean, think outside the box. Don't be afraid to take that big step. And I dream of the day. I dream of the day when we can do landscape scale work, you know, applying what Brian has been working on his career here. And just start doing this. I mean, it just needs to be done.
Thanks for that, Keith. Okay, great. Well, let's dig into a couple of specific questions that we didn't get a chance to get to. And let's go with this first one is for Tanya. Bear with me here and here we go. Yeah, this was from John Patton. And the question is, are the slash pile locations defined in advance as part of a cut plan mapping around existing cedar stands and in relation to avoidance and protection of traditional cultural properties? How are these impacts defined in advance as part of the contractor pre-cut briefings?
Yeah, so each of our projects have a full NEPA done on them. So if there is cultural concerns, we are aware of them. A lot of the areas we're working in do not have cultural concerns. And if they did, we would definitely change our management to fit protection of those. In terms of where piles are placed, they're not predetermined. Those are more just, we told the logger we want them approximately 15 to 20 feet apart, and he just worked with whatever his machinery could work with what he had for materials. So that's why, like in the red pine stand, those piles were a lot further apart than what they were in the white spruce, just because he had less material to work with. I think that answers the question. If I forgot part of it, please let me know.
That sounds good. And if that question needs to be answered or asked a different way, just put it back there in chat again, John. Tanya, while we're still with you and while some of the Forest Service folks are back on the screen, and this may be for folks who are in the audience working closely with Tanya, I'm going to bring this question up again that got asked, but you couldn't answer it. So this is related to snowshoe hare. And the question was, how much revenue is kept back in the form of hare habitat? And does that funding cover that lost revenue? Or does your funding cover that lost revenue? Can you expand on that? So that was that Tanya, I don't know if you can help facilitate that question to your partners, but the answer, it felt like, might need to come from the agency.
Yeah, I think that's a question that'll have to be answered by Chippewa National Forest. I'm not sure who's all on today, or are they even able to take off their mic or put their mic on, I should say.
I don't think so, but Kevin Shepard does offer in chat that this remains to be seen since the project is fairly new. It's just a little too soon, it sounds like, and that's fair enough. But a good question from Gina Abramson, who is looking to better understand how these really special, unique projects play out in all ways. So thank you, Kevin. Yes, if folks can chime in with answers from the audience too. This is just a big, this is your opportunity to learn from one another. So please keep these questions coming. Jenny Selgrath asks, she says she has a few questions. In his background, she works with NOAA and in California, where many of the tribes are not federally recognized. Did the specific treaty rights influence what the MOU and the co-management agreements could cover? I don't know, Jenny, if this might be a question, I'm sorry, Jen, if this might be a question for you. This question is from Jenny.
Well, I'm gonna sound silly, but I'm gonna ask Keith and Tanya, because they're actually in the throes of the inception of this, because every MOU we have in the Forest Service is different based on the treaty and the ask of the tribes. We don't drive what they're looking for. And I saw you're in California, and I did put a response in there. Rowena Yako is the Forest Service Tribal Relations Specialist in California. And so a lot of those treaties and those communities don't have treaty ceded territory like we do here. So everything is a unique situation, but I'm going to defer to my colleagues here as this was being, created. You were there during the conversations where I wasn't, so.
I mean, we had, what exactly are treaty rights? It was a talk that, not our current environmental law director, but a prior one, and it wasn't that when the treaty came out that, the federal government gave indigenous people, this right, that right, you all get it right. It was rights that were retained. The federal government took land. They took this. But if it wasn't mentioned in the treaty that they're taking it, then it's a retained treaty right. So, it's always there. And we hammered that home. It could be whatever your mind could come up with. If it's not mentioned in the treaty, it is the tribes. It is the tribal treaty right to have. California, I don't know much about it, but my understanding is the state recognizes those rancherias out there. And I don't know if there's a weird three-way mix that a guy could get where the state starts working with the feds. I don't know. It's been a problem with Intertribal Timber Council trying to deal with non-federally recognized tribes. So. Yeah,
and Keith, that's a really good point. And that's why I put in there, Rowena would be a really good person to contact with the Forest Service, because I grew up by the Crit Reservation, and it is definitely different than the Lake States. It is a completely different way of working through processes. So, and even in this region and Region 8 of the Forest Service, we have state recognized tribes. And one of the things for us as a federal agency recognizing the sovereign status of tribes is they have to be on a list that is published by BIA that says they have done all the process, which is a very long, complicated process to become a federally recognized tribe. But we still honor state recognized tribes, but they do not have the same status to come sit at the table as a federally recognized tribe. So there's some nuances there that we don't want to go down in a rabbit hole, but it becomes a challenge because you don't want to be disrespectful or not recognize as a federal agency all tribes, but there is some legal sideboards for us as a federal agency. So.
Very good. Anybody else have any comment related? Switching gears to pollinators. Laurel Trevino asks if has anybody mentioned the function of flowering understory shrubs such as blueberry as food sources for native pollinators, especially native bees? A corollary to this question is, has anybody looked at the impact of understory fruiting shrubs on birds that typically disperse fruits and seeds? Let me clarify, I don't mean Western honeybees that are managed by beekeepers, but native solitary bees that inhabit woodland edges and pocket prairies and forests.
Laurel, I saw Kate Hagston answered that. She's our botanist here at Leech Lake. And her and I, we have conversations. I mean, some of this work that we're doing in the pine stands, she's the one that's going to be putting the native seed down there, and it's rusty patched bumblebee. She's very passionate about that. She's passionate about all the bees around here. And we've talked about pursuing, we do get some sort of native flowering forbs of some sort to start getting more bee style habitat. It's difficult for me to talk about because I try to stay in my own lane. I would say she's our bee expert, but yeah, I mean, it is definitely something that we're looking at. Again, it's all inclusive. So.
Okay, I think that Jonathan Long's question regarding the Leech Lake Band's agreements with the Chippewa National Forest, that they are available online. I think that they are, and whether or not they specifically reference co-management or do they use a different term. I don't know if anybody can answer that question without looking at the agreement. Is anybody familiar enough to know how that's treated, Jen?
Yeah, Lisa, I'll go ahead and start off, and if Keith wants to jump in, that'd be good. They are available if you go to the Chippewa National Forest website. We have a tribal relations page, and so you can get all that information. You can get some of the history, some of the things we talked about today. That's all there for people to look at. The original MOU talks about shared decision making, but since 2021, the Washington office and there was a group that have been talking about the language of co-management. So as an agency, we're still trying to figure out what best practices are for us and what language encompasses our responsibilities to tribes, to bands, to everyone that we serve, making sure that we're using the most inclusive language possible, that we're not missing something. Because if you think about shared decision making, that does miss some things linguistically and in a framework way as to what we're trying to achieve. So, but that was the chief's ask. That's what our MOU says, is shared decision making. And so co-management is now the place we are moving, the language we're moving to use in a much broader sense as we work and serve the tribes.
Great. Keith, anything to add, to offer to that? Okay.
I would ask Stephen too, if Stephen has anything too, because he might have something.
I also feel like I'm, I don't know, maybe at the outer circle of the bullseye in terms of the Leech Lake and Chippewa National Forest specific relationship. It's been fun to participate and to help, but yeah, I don't think I'll add anything at this point.
Okay. Very good. There's one that I'm going to go back to that came early, and it was right after Keith and Jen's presentations. And it was from Kate Laramie, and it was to follow up on Keith's point about listening twice as much and coming from a good place. How would you recommend starting those listening relationships in a genuine way? Her organization has had some concerns about showing up to tribal or native events and not wanting to seem, she calls it, too eager or making folks uncomfortable by presenting ourselves in those spaces. If you have any more conventional wisdom to offer in that regard for Kate.
Well, I think when you go into, if you want to have a meeting with somebody, I mean, you want to have that meeting, right? So, I mean, that's already inherent. But if you have concern, and again, if you're coming from a good place, if you got that concern and it's eating you in the back of your head, it's just a little voice back there. I don't know. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to be pushy. Just say so. Just come out there and say, I'm not used to this. I don't know what the right thing is to do. I don't want to be pushy. Nip it in the bud. Just address that 800-pound gorilla that's in your head right away. People have a hard time doing that, addressing 800-pound gorillas in the room. But I think once you do it, it's incredibly releasing. That's what I would say.
And I could offer a little bit too, is
Jen?
where I sit is I have 1 foot in who I am and 1 foot in the role I have in the federal agency. And sometimes those are a challenge for me personally, but, recognizing those. And one of the things that, like he said, is asking questions. It's okay to ask questions. So, and recognize that my tribe is not the same as Leech Lake. And so you're going to have different cultures, different practices. You're going to have different ways of being. And so asking for clarity and saying, I don't understand. Now, the one thing is you may not get an answer because it might not be something that I can tell you or someone else can tell you. It might be, something that is very culturally significant to me that I'm not going to share. But when you're going into these meetings, it's always bring snacks. I tell everybody I'll be there if there's a snack, but it's being real. It's coming with, leading with the best intention, not a check the box. It's leading with, we all have a job to do. And, some are different than others, and we're not always going to see eye to eye. We're not. That's the reality of it. But when I talk about our core values as the Forest Service, one of them is conservation. We all can agree that conservation is a place where we could start a conversation because that's what we're doing. We just are doing it through different lenses. So when you're sitting down with others and you're new or you're nervous, like Keith said, be honest, say, I've not done this before. So please tell me if I am being disrespectful, if I am not honoring, building this relationship with you. And so it's having those conversations, but also, getting to a place where we can all get our work done and do the best thing for the land. So thanks.
I think that's a beautiful place to wrap today's symposium. Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Keith, and Tanya, and Brian, and Stephen. This was fantastic. On behalf of the staff and board of our organization, we're grateful to have you here today and to share these experiences, which I think people are going to be talking about for a long time. So, and thank you for making yourself available to folks after the symposium if they've got questions and they want to reach out. I offer that on your behalf. I hope you're okay with that, but we have high confidence that you are. Thanks to one and all for attending. Thanks to the USDA Forest Service, our partner in underwriting and helping us to bring this program to you. And if you found this content to be of value, this is what we do. This is what the Natural Areas Association does. So if you think of ways in which we can help any of you in the future to get, again, good science methodologies, practices in front of others, all in an effort to do the best jobs we can as practitioners, please don't hesitate to reach out. We hope to see some of you in Duluth for the conference in September. And thank you one and all for everything you do every day in your work to take care of these places that we hold near and dear. So with that, thanks. Take good care, and we'll see you again soon.